Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to Starman and the Boomer. We are back on our regular schedule with our regular content.
Yeah, yep.
This is not. Like I said, we did our Q&A stream last week. You guys seem to enjoy that. It's done decently well. Usually Q&A streams do pretty badly, so you guys seem to be pretty hungry for questions answered.
I think it was really good. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed having a little bit of contact with the community relations, community whatever. Yeah, there's I'm sure there's some corporate buzzword for it, but yeah, it was nice last week.
Engagement.
I enjoyed it. Community
they
engagement.
Call it engagement.
There we go. Yeah. Yeah. No, that was nice. It was good to have some feedback from people.
Yes, it was.
Normally, you occasionally get the odd super chat, but I do not have time to keep an eye on the chat all the time, which is sad. But there's too much to be concentrating on. I need an extra set of eyes to be on the chat all the time, otherwise.
Oh yes. Well, it's kind of our normal streaming stuff going on here. As I said, we do have our. Well, you guys have joined as well, so we have our member shoutouts to do. As we usually do. I'm just waffling because the YouTube backend isn't playing ball. There we go. Okay, so we have, how many members have we got here? Quite a few members. Good lord, yeah, a lot of you in the last week joined. So yeah, it's I think we're up to 1, 2, 3, 4. It's way over 10. I think it's actually it's the same as last week, but like 3 people joined during last week's stream. So, in terms of memberships, these are all Venus Bros, by the way. None of you have gone for the cheaper option, which is nice of you. We have James Merry, Portrait Seal, HK9410, who's actually donated. I'll read that in a sec. They donated like before we started. The Real Yaddle, Be Happy, Socratic, Canadi Hindustan, Velkus, Wig in all caps, Cerberine, Windtalker, and Wes. So, thank you all for being members. That's really good. That's crazy. All of it helped. And, well, yeah, the fact is that you guys have been very generous. We've already got a super chat from Coney current year saying thoughts on Coolidge. We'll get into Coolidge soon. We will get into that. We're kind of doing the preamble right now, the pre-stream, which is always fun. And we have a donation here through Streamlabs. Streamlabs is the best way to donate to us. Again, boilerplate, but it really is. They take the least cut, which is quite nice. But yes, it's a case of we have Streamlabs, we have super chats, we have memberships, and generally you guys have been very generous. So HK9410 donated $20, saying, "Today I'm driving a blood donation bus from Arizona to Texas without air conditioning, so while I'll be watching, I can't engage throughout the stream like normal." Well, thank you for the $20 there. Again, that's a pretty decent chunk of change. Looking for your support throughout the stream, and yeah, hopefully we'll be able to entertain you through all of this. I don't know, Trig. You've done quite a lot of reading this week yourself as well, haven't you?
I have.
Good lord, there's a lot of reading for me.
I have. Yes, I took a nice bit. Last week was great because I actually got time to suddenly go, yay, I'm going to play computer games again. I haven't done that in ages. But we've been back into the reading again. Huge amounts of reading, lots of stuff, and no, it's been fun as always. Lots of Rothbard, lots of Hop. Watched a couple of very, very good streams, actually, that Duncan recommended I watch, comparing Marxism and Hopper stuff.
Have you been watching some Peter Aquinas?
That's the one. I thought you might be aware of that.
And he's got his mad friend who talks about only needing 3% of people to commit acts of terrorism. Getting into the real stuff there. But no, it's yeah, a lot of the people like that on that end, I quite enjoy stuff like Free Man Beyond the Wall. Again, very neat. A lot of the Mises stuff is very entertaining and gets actually quite a small amount of views for how good it is, I will say. It's run about kind of the level that we're at, which again is what really inspired me to take on this stream, even though I'm not an expert in this subject matter, to be honest. I'm not an economist, and a lot of this is us learning as we go. And me trying to remember stuff I read years ago. Like I said, I'm trying to get more back into the reading materials. But yes, today we're doing well, I guess the first part of our interwar streams.
Yeah.
Because we're doing. I've had to. Well, Sorry, I keep saying I. We do work on this together, guys.
We do, yeah. Because you were like, oh, we're going to do 1920 to 1930, and I sort of went back because like we're going to have this is a long one because there's a lot of shall we say new players getting onto the football pitch in this period that we're not going to touch on in this particular one. We're going to have to separate economics, politics, and actual history into different bits here because we ain't gonna do Hitler, Munich Beer Hall Putsch, Lenin, Stalin, Mussolini, all of those guys at the same time as what we're gonna do today. There's no way of doing that without us being here, until mid-Friday, maybe next week.
That's like a 6-hour stream now.
At least, yeah.
This stream is quite narrow focused. It's 20 to 29, but what we are really focusing on are causes of the Great Depression. Yeah. We're not going to go into too much detail, and there's a few key highlight events we have to go through in both British and American history, since this is British and American focused at the moment, really. But we do have 2 special episodes coming up. We have one next week, which will be about Keynesianism, with our actual researcher on, who does actually a lot of the steering of the reading. Big thank you to them. You'll hear from them next week. I never know whether to call them Duncan or Evelyn because they're kind of going through a change there.
It's
yes. Libertarian tranny, such a meme.
I'm with you there. I think I'm trying to get onto the Evelyn. I first knew Evelyn as Duncan, well, through you, a while back, and so it takes a while just to get head in order on that one. But I think
they'll be with us next week though.
Yeah. But,
it's a case of, again, we've got that coming up, the Keynesianism special, and we also have, after that, we're going to talk about totalitarianism and kind of it's classically seen as the rejection of democracy, but every totalitarian state in Europe, in the later period and that is forming during this period, sees themselves as a democracy and actually sees themselves as a more pure form of democracy, which is quite an interesting thing we can't cover right now. And like I said, I've had to take the Soviet stuff out this stream. I know Lenin's there in the thumbnail and he's there, guiding the market upwards, which I thought was funny. But,
it's a good picture.
Yeah, he will. Spoiler alert: we will not be mentioning the Soviets in this stream, but this is kind of the first of a series of our interwar stuff. Because, we're not just doing the 2 within the time period. We're going to do, like I said, this is going to have 2 special episodes. So we've got this episode, including this episode, we've got 4 episodes before we get to the Second World War. But it will be worth it, and I think it will mean these aren't like 4-hour streams, like some of them are getting towards previously. We've had to cover it, and we've had to learn from what we're doing, and maybe not slow it down a bit, but reel it in a bit.
You get me talking about commies, and it's instant 20-minute rant on communism bad, okay. And that's fun, but we can't just do that every single week. That's easy.
No, we can't. But yeah, I don't know. We're gonna get a little bit less in terms of stage setting for this one, because really last week was all stage setting. I think we've really grounded people in the consequences of the First World War and where we are now. I don't know, just a brief recap, really, Trig. I don't know. In terms of Europe, I know you were very, very adamant about the whole, moving of border stuff, and you're right about that. That is extremely important.
There was a huge amount of border reshuffling. The League of Nations has been created, and essentially after the First World War has chopped up big chunks of Europe. The old empires that we had known previously have all pretty much gone at that point. And Germany has got a big fat chunk of it missing that is now Poland. And there's sort of like a corridor that they all want back in the near future, I think, from there. But
yes.
But I'm sure that could be negotiated. Nothing bad could probably happen from that mistake.
Well, yes, that is the international scene right now, and what we've got in the Western world or the Western powers is the mass expansion of democracy. Again, we're focused on the UK and the US through this, but we talked about the Representation of the People Act and the 19th Amendment, and also Prohibition, which really just coincides almost exactly with the 19th Amendment, as we talked about with Rothbard, with women as a special interest group. That is really where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in this first period of what I would call kind of like... It's like the first iteration of post-democratization, in that we're in this period of the first kind of mass franchise. There isn't equality of vote between everybody yet, but the bulk of people and the bulk of age groups really now, even though the voting age is a bit higher in certain places, can vote and can participate in these new democratic systems to a degree we have never seen before.
Very much so. Very much so. And I think it's interesting because we're about to dive into this, and so I'm gonna segue us over it rather rapidly. America has, under Woodrow Wilson, has paved the new world government as well.
Yes.
The League of Nations, which was an utter shambles. Anybody that's studied GCSE history or sort of history at a basic level will learn very rapidly. The League of Nations, utter shambles, totally toothless, and the UN is much better. Lol. Which is not really. And the main reason for that is, of course, the Woodrow Wilson pushed for it, and then the moment they actually started getting it together, Woodrow Wilson up and died, thank God, and America immediately went, nah, we're having nothing to do with this, which...
fuck this shit.
It's a pity they didn't take that opinion, say, 4 years beforehand, and maybe we wouldn't have had a First World War happen in the way we did.
Well, what we find ourselves in... Woodrow Wilson entered the war saying he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Yeah. And now we see ourselves in, a world made safe for democracy. This is the world forged in Woodrow Wilson's image. The man's dead, but we will feel his presence throughout this period still. He's lingering like a bad ghost. And really the first kind of myth of this period I want to bust, because as you probably noticed with your history education too, Trig, the 1920s as taught in schools is a mess. Totally. It doesn't make any fucking sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I said this to you. This is essentially, this is the period that we're doing, this whole study, was the period I studied for history GCSE along with the assassination of Kennedy. And the 1920s is the League of Nations happened, the separation, this, that, and the other, blah, 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 blah. And then the Great Depression happened for no reason whatsoever other than capitalism went rampant and everything crashed and everyone was very, very poor. And anyone that actually asks any more than a what, please can you go into that in any more detail, you get brushed aside. Well, we're not really covering that in the syllabus here. We're going to go into why Hitler is bad.
Yes. You essentially end up straight in the 50s.
Yes.
You do. They talk about the events of World War II. They gloss, the military events. But a lot of the social stuff in terms of interwar years, it's like, well, capitalism destroyed itself so bad. But the first myth really is isolationism.
Yes.
And isolationism is something abhorrent and strange. I was probably taught the 1920s, maybe in a little bit more detail than you were, because I did history at A level as well. I did like a pre-degree course in it too. I was given a special history course whilst I was doing it. And the way we taught about it was that isolationism was not only abhorrent and a mistake, but it was a break from tradition almost, which really isn't true. Well, it isn't true. There's some very interesting stuff when it comes to American history and its involvement with the rest of the world.
As far as I'm concerned, the isolationism, if it was that in the first place, which I don't really think it was, and if it was only for a very short period of time, but the isolationist sort of history of America dates back to the Monroe document. It goes way, way back in terms of...
Well, the Monroe Doctrine, yes.
Monroe Doctrine, rather, yes, which was, what was that, 1823? So we're talking basically 100 years prior to it. America had basically said, we'll leave Europe alone as long as you leave the Americas and the Western Hemisphere alone. Essentially. Not that they paid any attention to that during the First World War, but prior to that, they by and large stuck to it. They'd just sort of gone, okay, yeah, we won't bother Europe as long as you don't bother the Americas, and that includes South America. They kindly turned a blind eye when England went, oh, these Falkland Islands, these look like tactically nice places to have. I think we'll have those. Yoink. Which was very kind of them. Thank you very much. But other than that slight blind spot for them, they'd stuck to it up until the First World War. And so going back to it, isolationism kind of falls back into that thing. And I don't think it's a bad thing. Every time America gets mixed up in foreign policies, as we've seen for the last 30 or 40 years, it's a bit messy. In fact, longer. 100 years.
Yes, it was. There's also the issue as well that like I said, the 1920s and the 1920 election, you end up with Calvin Coolidge, who we're really only going to touch on. He was, not Calvin Coolidge, we end up with Warren Harding,
yes.
Who preceded Calvin Coolidge. And he was in office from only briefly from 1921 to 1923. And like I said, we're not going to cover him in detail, we're going to kind of skip over him. But what he revealed really was the complacency, one of the Republican Party, and kind of the American people. He was well loved in his time period, but there's this scandal called Teapot Dome that was the biggest scandal in American history until Watergate, really, in which it turned out that, it leaked out again that the American public was being made a fool of by their politicians and they were just enriching themselves. So that's kind of a background detail here. What we really have is, as you're showing there with there's like a Norwich University source here. This is the normal telling of history. This is history as taught to you in the classroom.
Yes, this document is very normy as well. But it's not a million miles from it, but it is very, very normy. It is not. It is very. It has a pro Woodrow Wilson bias to it. The section here. Upon re-election, Woodrow Wilson was resolute in staying out of the war. He, even at a significant moment within the general American government, advocated for preparedness in the face of events that signified growing German and international aggression, and basically hints towards the fact that Germany was going to sail all the way over towards America and invade America if Woodrow Wilson didn't charge over there and kick old Bosch in the chops. Well, which is a bit, what, really?
Yeah, it is a bit what. What we see here when it talks about the League of Nations, and we talked about it last time, the American public, their absolute refusal to join the League of Nations. They had to be press ganged essentially into World War One. They really didn't want to do it. they had to have the Lusitania and all that. You had to have the Zimmerman telegram. You had to have a huge amount of cajoling from Wilson and the warmongers to get them into World War One.
Yes.
And they were not happy about it afterwards. They were happy about the victory and the peace. There was some sweeping up there, but they couldn't capitalize on that to bring in the League of Nations. No. And what you end up with, you end up with Warren Harding, and you end up with a very familiar story that we see here. It talks about tariffs, where they go into the fact that the Republican Party was much more interested in slight tariff reform and slight reduction of taxes from their massive wartime high. But what you see is there is not a return to, I think it's Coolidge who talks about normalcy. There's not a return to the way things were pre-war. That is a myth. The idea that America went back, just tried to ignore the First World War and tried to pretend that internationalism didn't exist is absurd. It's bullshit. It never happened. It couldn't have happened. That's not how that works. That's not how that worked. It is an affectation of viewing it from our current point of view and viewing it from the post-1950 point of view. This is the history as written, I guess, by the ultra-statists, not to get too ANCAP here. It's history as written by people who view interventionism and total states as neutral. That's what we see here.
Yeah.
And what we get is Coolidge, who doesn't roll back on things like the Federal Reserve, which we'll get to later. All he does really is he cuts taxes, cuts a little bit of regulation, gets rid of some of the war collectivism, because, it's a war economy. They can't explicitly keep a war economy going, but a lot of the trappings stay there. Harding's administration is recorded in history as, cutting regulation, cutting taxes, putting the pedal to the metal and creating the seeds of, what Coolidge would do later as kind of the building of the Great Depression, the failure of laissez-faire capitalism. And that is just not true. Things do not go back to the way they were before. There is some slight knob turning. It's 5% here, 2% there kind of stuff. The fundamental policies of interventionism in an economic sense and the fundamental policies of basically unrestricted reserve banking and the increase in power of the Federal Reserve continue unabated. As I put in my... Yeah.
Well, they'd raise these taxes, and they never. No government has ever cut back majorly on taxes. They might drop it a little here and there, and I mean certainly England cut the super tax etc. back in the 70s or whenever it was, which was 90-odd%. But by and large, they never really wind back taxes because all of that money is coming into the government all of a sudden. And
yes, again we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but in terms of foreign policy,
yes, nothing
actually meaningfully changes. They're still meddling in world affairs. They're still meddling in South America because they were still doing that under the Monroe Doctrine. America has never been fully isolationist. Not in the sense of somewhere like Japan was. They never shut their borders and didn't let people in anymore. In fact, during this period, there's still large amounts of immigration going on, as there was during Woodrow Wilson's period. There is no meaningful isolationism. It's isolationism as compared to the extreme globalism of Woodrow Wilson, and the traditional reading of history frames that as a bad thing.
Yes, I mean they did actually start putting in immigration quotas, and I think this was around about this time, the border patrol and sort of a general immigration service started to actually be created, if I remember rightly from reading through this. But by and large, they were still meddling in big time in sort of.
Well, I gotta say this is one of the first instances of actual immigration control in the US.
Yeah.
The numbers they were seeing were unsustainable. It was uncontrolled mass immigration that actually they came into conflict weirdly with the establishment. In fact, the Europeans who were coming in were less likely to accept the socialistic tendencies of someone like Woodrow Wilson. It's kind of funny that this was all in the works before the Harding and Coolidge administrations. And it was really inevitable because of the mess Europe was in. There were these large immigrant populations, and it didn't really work. A lot of people still came to the US during this period. It really was kind of a paper tiger. They did not manage to meaningfully restrict the amount of people coming into the US. And to be fair, there were other factors as well that reduced it from its massive heights in kind of 1907 to 1910, when they saw millions coming in, literally millions coming in a year in a smaller population country.
They got kind of based with their immigration as well. They were literally sort of going, look, you're sick, you're disabled, you're criminals. No, you're undesirable. And then they sort of moved into, as I've highlighted there, certain shall we say, Middle East and Russia and Asian countries were just totally blocked. America decided to actually protect its borders. I don't know if they were doing much with regards to the Mexican border at that particular point in time. But
well, there wasn't the incentives as we see now.
No.
The US had some trappings at the beginnings of having a welfare system and somewhat a welfare state, but it didn't yet. But what it had was the idea that it was stable and safe compared to the absolute mess they've made in Europe. There's a great line here from the Historic University before we move on that says, during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, the United States briefly shed its isolation-based foreign policy in order to defend democracy on a global scale. You can just feel the propaganda dripping from some of this.
It was, when I was reading it, it did make me somewhat annoyed. It does seem to hold Woodrow Wilson on a very, very high pedestal. And considering it's a university document, that's, yeah.
Well, this is what the neutrality. This is the idea of the kind of that's just a neutral fact. You know, the neutrality of history is one of the things I want to demolish with this series. In that, what you are taught is propaganda, and most of the mainstream sources on what is, a bullshit statement that America became isolationist again. That is not what happened. That is functionally not what happened. You can just prove that, and we will prove that throughout this stream, that there was mass intervention on an economic scale going forward. There was no public push for that either. There was no public opinion for the war. There was no public opinion for the creation of the Federal Reserve, and there was no public opinion for the greater centralization of central banking, as we will see later. The 1920s, I think, are a period, I don't know, there's these strange periods, like I talked about kind of before the stream with you, Trig, where you end up in unreality. And the 1920s are a great example of unreality, both in foreign policy and economic policy, because what is stated at the time and what is recorded in history isn't what happened. Things appear to change, but ultimately the systems behind them don't.
Yes.
There is the illusionary, as we will get to again. I keep mentioning Burnham and I keep mentioning Soul, but we'll get to their actual theory in later streams. But we see what is essentially a cycling of the elites. We see the Woodrow Wilsons, the Democratic Party coming out, and Harding and Coolidge coming in, but nothing actually meaningfully changes.
Well,
and isolationism is a good example of that.
I mean, there was no push. Certainly with things like the Fed and so on, as we covered, these things had to be created almost in secret, behind closed doors, without the public watching, just like income tax, etc., because the general public would have been up in arms about an awful lot of this. American public back in the early 20th century rather, was actually quite isolationist. They actually didn't want to have anything to do with what was going on in Europe. It was your international bankers and your beginning of your internationalists, shall we say, that were, and as you said, they were creating things that were unreal, not real at all. Essentially, acting on things that created a reality. And that reality actually, unfortunately, started to fall apart quite rapidly towards the end of the 20s for them. Especially with regards to banking and getting government involved in economics in particular, which we will discover later when we start talking about Keynesianism, is seen to be the great saviour of the world, and how capitalism bad and gets government involved is good. Whereas, in fact, it's actually more realistic. Let's put it this way. If capitalism left unfettered would be a little more harsh at times, but it would be harsh in so much as, pulling the bandage or the sticker over the wound off stings at the time, but you get better damn quick, a lot more quickly, rather than getting governments involved and suddenly end up with 10-year recessions, which we've seen time and time again, growing up through 80s, 90s, early 2000s. You don't have to look very far to see what we experienced or what the world experienced in the 20s, in the Great Depression, playing out over and over and over again. And it's the same nonsense. It's the same huge big government getting involved in big banks, bailing out the people that caused the mess. And prolonging the stress for everybody else, and not letting the sick, weak, and useless organisations die, and letting new ones come through. But I'm getting way ahead of ourselves on this one. I'm almost jumping to the final conclusions.
The final conclusion, eh?
Yes, yeah, not quite a solution, but there might be a solution in there involved somewhere in Minecraft. And yes, I love this little little cartoon you dug up. The child who wanted to play by himself, which is, the Temple of Peace, denoting the
Yes.
League of Nations.
Maniacal Foreigner in the chat actually brings up a good point. There was a recession in 1920, which did self-correct. But part of how it, quote-unquote, self-corrected was actually an increase in the money supply. They tweaked, they did do, again, we don't have time to cover the recession of 1920. It's an interesting point of history. Please research it yourself. It does have some relevance to this, but we just don't have time to talk about it. But I will mention it. In the fact that, yes, it did self-correct because they didn't overcorrect, but there was some increase in the money supply to try and deal with it. There was a lot of the factors we will talk about later on that exacerbated the later crises because they didn't learn from that. But what the wrong lesson they learned from both World War One and kind of the post-war recession was that you have to take some of the pressure off the economy, but you can alleviate it in the short term, and you can essentially go into the realm of unreality by printing money, and you can really soften the blow. And that is what they tried to do as well as during the 1920 crisis. There was still intervention from the Fed. And what the Fed did and what the reserve banks did is they increased the money supply, which we'll have to get onto, because it's extremely important to understand that this was an inflationary boom based on the increase of the money supply. And to talk about that, we have to talk about the definition of the money supply, which it's kind of, I don't know, a bit of harder economic theory here. But I think it would worth it in the long run, because I don't think you can talk about what we're going to talk about later without understanding this. And again, we're going to be taking a lot from Rothbard here because he has the best writing about it. He has the greatest writing, the best writing. And this is from Rothbard's just The Great Depression, which is a wonderful book.
It is.
I think it does a great job of elucidating the situation. And the big kind of underpinning definition here is how he defines what the money supply is. I think we're on page 87 of the actual script here. He's talking about the inflationary factors that led to the Great Depression. And
is this the Mises Daily article, or is this the full?
Oh no, this is the actual book itself.
Okay.
It's there'll be links to this in our references. It's page 131.
It is page 131.
In the PDF that the Mises Institute has, but it's page 87 of the actual book, because it has like 4 different forewords on Rothbard's Great Depression, which some of them are pretty good. I was going to include a bit of one in a later episode, but we'll see that later. Yes, it's very important that you understand that all of this, the Roaring Twenties, the supposed post-war boom, was led by inflation. It was an inflationary boom, and it was done by essentially printing money. They did it in many different, what they thought were clever ways, and they tried to hide it in many ways. But from 1920 to 1924, really, is the period, you get this mass expansion of the money supply. And Rothbard defines the money supply as such. Again, this is going to be a little bit dense and slightly obvious in places, but you really have to understand what he's talking about here. Money is the general medium of exchange. On this basis, economists have generally defined money as a supply of basic currency and demand deposit at commercial banks. These have been means of payment, either gold or paper money. In the United States, largely Federal Reserve notes, or deposits subject to check at commercial banks. Yet this is really an inadequate definition. De jure, only gold during the 1920s, and now only such government paper as Federal Reserve notes have been standard or legal tender. Demand deposits only function as money because they are considered perfect monetary substitutes, i.e. they readily take the place of money at par. Since each holder believes that he can convert his demand deposit into legal tender at par, these deposits circulate as the unchallenged equivalent to cash, and are as good as money proper for making payments. What he's talking about there is bank balances. As in, you don't have the money in your hand, there isn't actually gold there, but there is money on paper that is factored into the money supply. Let confidence in a bank disappear, however, and a bank fail, and its demand deposit will no longer be considered equivalent to money. The distinguishing feature of money substitute, therefore, is that people believe it can be converted at par into money at any time on demand. But on this definition, demand deposits are by no means the only, although the most important, money substitute. They are the only constituents of the money supply. They are not the only constituents of the money supply in a broader sense. So what he's talking about here is that you don't have to print notes for the money supply to increase. You don't have to bring in more gold for the money supply to increase. The money supply is bonds. It's, what people have on paper in banks. Mm-hmm. It's, Federal Reserve credit notes. It's war bonds. It's national debt. It's international debt. It's promissory notes. If anyone believes that what they have can be readily converted into legal tender or gold, as it should be, you should be able, in this period, to be able to exchange any of these bonds or promissory notes or, balance amounts into gold, because America is still kind of, and so is Britain, on the gold standard.
Yes.
That contributes to the money supply. Therefore, basically all financial service products that people believe, and the main point here is they have to be, it's the faith in them, it's fiat that turns them into part of the money supply. And you end up with more things being money, quote unquote, than it really should be on paper. They aren't just printing money by printing money. They are printing money by issuing financial products, bonds, and essentially substitute promissory notes, which massively increase the money supply.
It's IOUs on top of IOUs. I remember seeing a film called Zeitgeist. I plugged it before as well, I think last week. Quite a while back, and they were talking about how the fractional reserve banking system works, and they get it wrong in that. It's actually not very good description, but the way they get it wrong is they by no means touch on how bad it actually is. But essentially, you've sat there, the bank may have 10 million or 10 billion in gold or whatever, and it loans out 10, maybe 100 times more than that in promissory notes, in these IOUs that we call dollar bills or pound notes, which I don't know if it says it on the Americans ones, but certainly on the English £5, £10 notes, it is written there, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10. And then there's got a little squiggle with the signature of the chairman of the Bank of England. It is, every single pound note in circulation is a promissory note that you should be able to cash in for whatever that actually means in reality. But it doesn't mean anything in reality because we're no longer on a gold standard.
Well, and none of the goods that this money was supposed to represent actually existed.
Yeah.
There's a great chart if you want to get it up. I think it's the money supply chart that I linked. It's just literally called money supply during the Great Depression era. It's the big green chart one. But that shows in very, very, very plain terms that despite kind of the actual production, the actual, America wasn't going through the same kind of boom it was during the Industrial Revolution here. The actual manufacturing base and the actual goods being produced weren't going up at an alarming rate. Not an alarming rate, but a kind of a great rate of knots like they were during the Industrial Revolution. Yet what we see here is an explosion in the money supply. It is, you get to 1915 and then you get to kind of a slight correction in 1920 because of all the froth and all the inflation from fighting the war. But after that, what you see is that inflation continues at wartime levels.
Yeah. And it's there's no more gold being dug out of the ground during this time. There's no more. It is all paper money that is created as a promissory note to actually pay. And as we'll see, they'll get rid of the ability for people to own gold later on to really screw this up. There is no other tender other than the paper that is a promissory note. And it's just rapidly growing and growing and growing and growing. And this chart is almost exponential when you actually wind it forward to modern day periods. It's wild. The billions that you see there end up in trillions by the
Well,
80s and 90s, but it's fake money.
I don't.
It's not real.
It is fake money.
It is
Yeah.
totally. It's fantasy, but people, as long as people act as if it's real, it stays being real. It's like.
Again, a lot of most of the sources we're going to use here are hard economics. There's some political policy stuff we'll be using, and some just normie sources again we'll be using to elucidate the mainstream explanation for it. But what we see here is the results of democratization. What we see here is the people giving over essentially control of their economic interaction to the government, which hands it to the Federal Reserve. And what the Federal Reserve does, it creates this massive bubble. All of the growth throughout the 1920s is inflationary based. It is based on them simply magicking financial products, money, debt, and credit out of thin air.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, devaluing the dollar, but in the process, creating this illusion that people are richer because they believe they are richer. But as we will see throughout this series, it has to meet the brick wall of reality at some point.
It's not just that as well. Because I've had this conversation with people that work in banking now as well. Is that the great supply of money allows banks and organisations to lend money to start-up businesses here and there, and not have to worry about. Some of them will fail, of course, but some of them will have the supply of money that they need to actually get their businesses up and running. Because you do not start a business this day and age without taking out a loan. Very few people start a business based purely on their own capital, because it's so easy to get a bank loan, a business startup loan or a grant from the government that just rolls out, big stack of cash, there you go, off you go. Doesn't matter if you fail or win, to be perfectly honest, the money doesn't exist anyway. And if you win, great, and if you fail, well, you can always start again after you've picked yourself up and dusted yourself off.
Yeah.
But this leads to a cycle of boom and bust that we have seen over and over and over again. It's horrifying. Really is actually really, really horrifying. And if only someone had seen, this back in the 20s.
Yeah.
But they had. That's the thing.
They had. The thing is, it seems obvious now, and it seems obvious looking at this. But the mainstream explanation for the Great Depression still isn't this. This is the Austrian economics definition, which is seen as far outside the mainstream. In fact, people try and slander it constantly. But what we see here is just in plain reality, this is what the money supply looks like. And GDP growth, wage growth, the growth in consumer goods, all of it is just driven by them imagining money. And as we'll come to next week when we talk about Keynesianism, the Keynesianism response to this wasn't that they shouldn't have done this. It's that, well, why didn't you just keep increasing? Why not just print more money? It's, well, if printing money artificially increases GDP, why not just keep artificially doing it? And this is fundamentally what I mean by this being a period of unreality.
This is what we're doing now. This is exactly what they're doing now.
Well, yeah, the disastrous economic policies of money supply, increase and money supply based inflation are exactly what take hold. They become the norm. This isn't something people learn from. And again, as we'll get to later, they're the exact same policies that we talk about as disastrous in Weimar Germany. They are just printing money. That is the simplest way I can put it. They are just printing money. There is nothing to back it up. There isn't the economic activity to back it up. They talk about stagflation later on in the mainstream view of history. Again, getting ahead of myself, but they're just printing money. And people still don't acknowledge this fact, that they fell on their arse because they were printing money like a child would do.
Yeah,
it really is just childish reasoning. And again, the reason this happened is because normal people, they abdicated, one, their knowledge of their economic interactions, and two, essentially they abdicated what is their own kind of like economic rights. In that what they did was they just said, well, people cleverer than me will sort it out.
It's not
Yeah.
It's not just the printing money as well. Something that's just really, really bothers me. They're not just printing money and creating money. They're also they're creating money and going, here, look, we've got all this extra money, and they're taxing the crap out of the general populace as well, at a rate that has never been seen before. So,
well, there is some taxation cuts, there is some reduction, but it never goes back to pre-war levels. Like I said, there's still higher income taxes, and what they do is they do what they always do. The Republicans lower income tax and bring in tariffs. It's the same today. What did Bush do? Bush lowered the Bush tax cuts.
Yes.
But there was a fiddling of knobs, and there was the illusion of. In fact, he didn't even do that. He just cut taxes and borrowed more.
Yes.
But Trump, again, what did Trump do? Trump cut taxes, raised tariffs.
Yeah.
But he didn't fundamentally change the underlying system, and that's what happens during this period. You end up with people talking about reduced taxes and irresponsible capitalism when someone's moved some knobs 2%. That's really what happened here, and the Federal Reserve continues creating all this money supply unabated. But sorry, we need to move on. We've got quite a lot to cover still. Good lord, I've just realised. We're about 40 minutes in already.
Yes, sorry, you've got everyone amused, and myself, with the idea that politicians just come in and twiddle knobs.
Well, they do. You went to public school, Troy.
Yes, I did. Yes. No, absolutely. It's without the obvious joke that it is a simple control board that they think they have, and yes, it's just we'll just raise this by 2%, drop that by 3%, and move this lever, and everyone will think they're better off because we've given them a fiver whilst my mates nicked a tenner out their back pocket.
Yeah,
it's here stuff.
Yeah, it is. It is again. It's the credit trap. Everyone gets stuck in the liquidity trap. And eventually what happens is you're all playing musical chairs, and eventually the music stops. That is fundamentally what happens here. But like we've already talked about some of this already. What we see here is wartime policy in peacetime. And we see this throughout kind of the democratization process. In that what happens with these democracies is you have a cycle in which people abdicate more of their rights to the state in return for democracy, and the state takes those rights, takes their money, and uses it to wage a war, and wage, in the new era, total war. And they use the total war as justification for more restrictions and more taxes. And those restrictions and taxes never fully go away in peacetime. And the cycles just repeat themselves. And, it turns out they don't even need something as big as a war. It could be, say, a political crisis, or, a domestic unrest, or a pandemic. It's any crisis, really. It's crisis spending and restrictions in non-crisis times. And because things are going well, because there's this unreality of the 1920s, people either don't notice or they don't care.
Yeah. As I said, they're oh look, I'm getting $50. This is great. I haven't noticed the fact that $45 is going out my back pocket. I'm no better off. And because the thing that I'm buying is now twice as expensive as it used to be. It's rob from rich. It's robbing Peter to pay Paul in a big way, and it's just spiraling up at this point. More money in the system means that the money you've got is worth less. You think you've got more because, people's brains don't catch up to the fact that, bigger number in bank account equals bigger number. The fact that, in my lifetime, in the 80s, a 3-bedroom house would cost £13,000 to buy. These days, they cost nearly £200,000 to buy. But people were still earning 40, 50 grand as an average wage, or in those days, 30 grand as an average wage in the 80s. These days, we're a little bit better off in our wages, supposedly, but everything costs, orders of magnitude higher. And this is what we're starting to see in the 20s happening. Things are getting more and more expensive. People have got more money, so they think it's all good, and they understand that, but they're not realizing they're getting poorer and poorer in real terms. Which way are we going to jump into more?
Well, first of all, we need to bring up that the taxation chart we talked about then.
Okay.
Because it's important people understand this. It's important people, again, we're going to keep returning to this because it's so important. But as you will see here, the taxes never meaningfully reduced. You can talk about policy, you can talk about tax cuts, you can talk about laissez-faire and smaller government all you want. The fact of the matter is that the GDP that the British and American governments take out of the economy slightly decreases right after the war, but then it starts increasing again. You get past where you were during, the strife and chaos of the First World War. You end up in a situation like in the US, you'll see here, it just keeps growing. And in the UK, it drops and then, stabilizes and grows slightly again. Because we were spending it such a horrendous... I mean, look at that jump during the First World War and look at how little it goes back down. These are the realities you cannot hide with rhetoric. You cannot hide with lies. And I think looking at this chart, you can just see the lies you've been told about history. Mm-hmm. It never returns anywhere near pre-war levels. It just trends upwards throughout this entire interwar period in the US, and it stabilizes at an incredibly high level here in the UK. The spending never goes away. The UK is servicing its debts, and the US is just pumping money into the economy.
I mean, Sweden and France. Good God, that's horrendous now. But yes, I mean, it is horrendous to think how much everyone says. Oh, democracy, power to the people. This something we have never had our earnings taxed so heavily in history before the last century, and it is all due to governments getting involved in economics. Economics being essentially fake and gay.
Fake and gay.
For the last 100 years. It is smoke and mirrors. The whole thing is smoke and mirrors, and print money and tax people at the same time, an ever increasing amount of tax. Which you know what? If you're printing money and you're using money via tax as a revenue source, I can only surmise that the tax as a revenue source is a lie, and it is just a way of impoverishing your workforce, your general populace. It is making them poorer, whilst devaluing the pound or the dollar at the same time by printing money. It is financial chains. It is slavery by other means.
Yes.
Getting on my high horse again. But yeah, I mean, look at that chart.
It's crazy. It is pretty crazy. I'm sorry, I'm just trimming the notes a tiny bit because I want to abridge slightly what we're going to be talking about here because it's a little bit technical. But going back to Rothbard's Great Depression, there's something extremely telling that happens here. And there's some good stuff before it too, which I'm going to touch on because he talks about acceptances, which is basically a new form of lending money on fictitious goods or it was supposed to be goods in transit, but it really is just lending against what become fictitious goods. That's slightly beside the point. I'm waffling a little bit here, but
it's all right. Waffle on. I've for some reason there it is. It's reappeared.
It's page 177 in the PDF.
Oh, I know.
Page 133.
OBS had decided to just go. No, I'm not looking at that page anymore. I am looking at nothing, and I couldn't get it back. There we go.
Oh, fair enough.
I found it.
No,
there we go.
Again, page 133. They have the book. 177 if you're using the Media's Institute PDF, which will be in the references. We do reference all of these streams. Go to our community tab or click on the pinned comment in any of these videos and you will find our references. What the Federal Reserve does is, in brief, before I get to some of the bond stuff, is that they really expand the fact that banks can have acceptances so they can basically receive payment in goods that are either in transit or a lot of the time they just don't turn out to be real. And they can do that to 150% of the value of their deposits eventually. Mm-hmm. They massively expand what is a niche area of lending and speculation into a massive area of leverage, and in doing so, they once again increase the money supply because you're doubling it. You've got promissory notes and you've got actual goods, and both of them are existing at the same time. I think that's the best way I can kind of explain acceptances here. It says, in short, the Federal Reserve granted virtual call loans to all the acceptance dealers, as well as unrestricted access at subsidized rates, and accorded these privileges to dealers who were not, of course, members of the Federal Reserve System. So they don't even have to be part of the Federal Reserve System to get these. What you see here is reserve banking credit being given to non-reserve banks. They are aiming the money printer at the rest of the economy. In fact, as unincorporated private bankers, the dealers did not even make public reports. So curiously jealous was the New York Bank of this secrecy of its favorites that it arrogantly refused to give a congressional investigating committee either a list of acceptance dealers from whom it had bought bills or a breakdown of foreign acceptances by country. The officials of the New York Bank were not cited for contempt of the committee. So basically, you've got these banks that are leveraged to, it says earlier in the text here, 150% once you get to 1928 of their value. And they're refusing to tell Congress who they're dealing with and where, basically where these fictitious transit goods are. And basically, it's like, oh, I'm going to import, say, 150 tons of seashells that's worth, $100,000 tomorrow. And I want you to keep a promissory note to that effect while the goods are in transit. And nobody's looking at this. Again, it's a shell game. They are inventing what is essentially money out of thin air. But the aspect I really want to talk about here is the U.S. government securities, because the U.S. government is issuing securities and issuing government bonds during this period like they were during the war.
Yeah.
They're essentially still selling what amount to war bonds. It's the same kind of practice here. I don't know, Trig, do you want to read this a little bit?
I can read this, sure. Okay, U.S. government securities. Member bank reserves increased during the 1920s largely in three great surges. One in 1922, one in 1924, and the third in the latter half of 1927. In each of these surges, the Federal Reserve purchases of government securities played a leading role. Open market purchases and sales of government securities only emerged as a crucial factor in Federal Reserve monetary control during the 1920s. The process began when the Federal Reserve tripled its stock of government securities from November 1921 to June 1922. That's in 1 year, well, less than a year, 6 months, essentially. They tripled.
Yeah, so it's gone from 200 million to 600 million.
Its holdings totaling 193 million at the end of October to 603 million at the end of the following May. It did so not to make money easier and inflate the money supply, these relationships being little understood at the time, but simply in order to add to the Federal Reserve's earnings. The inflationary result of these purchases came as an unexpected consequence. It was a lesson that was appreciatively learned and used from then on. This was the first time they went, hey, we've turned this dial and this shit's happened. Ha! Well, we'll make a note of that and use that in the future. It was literally, these are literally children playing with the controls of the car at this point.
Yeah, it is. What they did was they issued these government securities. Basically, the Federal Reserve took on government debt, and it factors into money supply because it's a promissory note. Like he just explained earlier, it is part of the money supply, and they brought in nearly $1 billion in government securities. Again, out of nowhere, this is money they're essentially printing, and it's money they're essentially printing to allow the government to spend. So it's government debt that adds to the money supply. You get all these toxic interactions like this with the Federal Reserve taking off its leash. And it's amazing that during this period, it's supposed to be quote-unquote laissez-faire capitalism. This is clear interference in the economy. I don't understand how anyone could see this. Like I said, we'll get to the myth of laissez-faire later on, but as you can see here, we have essentially wartime practices of the Federal Reserve carrying on throughout peacetime and throughout the 1920s.
Yeah.
You have mass kind of relaxing of the rules on imaginary money throughout this period. On all fronts, and that was really supposed to be the trickery they used to enable the First World War to take place and perpetuate itself. But they've become addicted to the credit. They become addicted to the money supply, and they become essentially just addicted to the lie.
Yeah, and it can only ever end badly, as it always does. Every single time we've seen this happen, which we've seen it happen, let's face it, we've seen it happen a lot in the last 100 years. I mean, it really has been. This has just been the last 100 years from now back to the 1920s. It has just been boom, bust, war, boom, bust, war, boom, bust, war, plague, boom, bust, war. That's it. So we've seen over and over. The history of the last 100 years has been that. We've had two.
Again,
sorry,
it has been, yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's the cycle it needs to take, because once you live in this world, this post kind of Woodrow Wilson world of interventionist economics, of an interventionist society, as it were, kind of interventionism and control from the top. Once you get a government that expands itself and meddles in the economics, and then meddles in the politics, and then meddles in the culture, and meddles in people's everyday lives, it has to self-perpetuate. You have to keep adding to it, and it has to keep justifying its own existence, which is kind of what this is. Nobody voted in the 1920 election to increase the money supply. Nobody voted in the 1920 election for the government to be able to essentially issue bonds to itself. Nobody voted, especially for these central banks to have mass access to be able to create their own financial products that essentially increase the money supply out of thin air. They were non-Federal Reserve banks were essentially printing money by creating their own, kind of promissory notes for goods in transit, or as it turned out, goods that didn't exist a lot of the time.
No one in their right mind would do. Would you?
No.
If someone said, "Hi, I'm going to stand as your local politician, and I'm going to stand on, we're going to triple the money supply in the next year. Yes, it does mean that every pound you've got will be worth 33p in a year's time, but there's going to be 3 times more of it." And your wages are going to double in that period. How wonderful is that? No one in their right mind would vote for that. In fact, they would probably try and lynch that person, or at least I would hope they would. I know I certainly would be out with the rope. And yet they do it anyway, and they've done it over and over and over again until now. It's a matter of you're born into this thing, and people seem to think this is the norm of how the world is and how it will always be in the future. Doesn't have to be.
It's seen as neutral is the thing. Sorry, I've realised I've missed 2 donations here. Skullhammer, $50. Thank you very much for that. He says it's always a ship. How we go to war. Yeah, it is always a ship.
Yes, indeed. In fact,
it's always a ship.
Look into how many ships, American ships, have been sunk, and what that has led to. It's when an American ship is sunk, it's always a bad idea. It's always something bad.
Yes, proper horror show with the £2 super chat. Double uwu daddy Scrump. Thank you for dragging this stream into the gutter where it belongs.
Cringe.
Big cringe and yeah, cringe and uwu pilled. Very very much so. Oh dear, it's again though. You'll find us repeating ourselves constantly throughout this, because it really is just a case of fictional economics. But the next aspect we need to talk about this, because again, time's marching on, is the democratization of credit. It is the fact that this money isn't only going to financial institutions and banks, it is making its way in very large amounts towards the general populace. And the 1920s, you see a little bit of the hat tipped in the mainstream view of history, that people talk about, buying stocks on margin. But because we're so addicted to cheap credit these days, no one talks about the fact that this was the first time that the middle class especially was massively over-leveraged and given large amounts of cheap debt.
Yeah, very large amounts of cheap debt. Let's see how much debt they actually... Oh, that's quite a lot.
That is... It's amazing how it mirrors GDP as well. Again, there's a lot of these charts I've actually just ripped off Wikipedia. Because what the numbers say and what the rhetoric says tends to be very different, and it's kind of odd in that. But you can see that
The
really
numbers,
all
Mason.
this
What do they
GDP,
mean? Sorry.
all this GDP, yeah, you're right. They do speak to me. All this GDP rise is based in debt. It is ridiculous how much private debt is happening during this period. It is a momentous increase, and it goes up by 50%, more than 50% this time period.
Yeah.
It's about 100,000 there. It's about 160 billion. Sorry. It's about 100 billion at the start. It's about 160 billion at the end. So it's 60% increase in private debt during this period. And it actually increases faster than GDP does. GDP doesn't keep pace. It's astounding that the mainstream reading of history doesn't talk about this. It talks about some bullshit about lending on margin, and I was taught about agribusiness, which has nothing to do with this, really. Yes, there was overproduction agriculturally. And again, that was part of the credit expansion. And you can see here, it's the pipeline. You get the mass credit expansion, you keep the wartime debt policies, and you end up with massive amounts of cheap credit making its way into the population and into businesses, small businesses, large businesses, people buying Model T Fords, as I show in the background here. All of this is due to central banking credit expansion. It's so simple. Like I will keep saying it. They are just printing money, and that is the problem.
Yes, relentlessly. Well, very definitely needlessly, and I don't know whether it is a case of them going, ha, money, big number go up, me feel better, dopamine kick, or whether they realise what they're doing, and it is a much more nefarious and devious scheme at hand. Certainly, either could be true. There's certainly going to be an awful lot of people going, ha, money go up, therefore I feel better, and go home and, shag the wife or mistress or whatever, dive into big pile of cocaine, as bankers are wont to do. It is very, yes, we're winning, but at the same time, I can't help feel that for ever as increasingly the chains get applied round the general public's legs and wrists, and that feels more continuous and nefarious. To it can't just all be ha money go up, feel better, without thinking about it. There's got to be something more nefarious behind it, if only by some people, but that are controlling this. But because it really has. Whilst the whole democratization, we're giving the power to the people, the reality of it is we're richer for goods and services, etc. But we are paying a hell of a lot for it all time. And as I was reading, it wasn't this one. It was the which was the name of the book that I was reading the other day about The Great Fiction.
The Great Fiction by Handsome and Hoppy. Yes.
Yeah, the wars in this era. Beforehand, when we had royal wars essentially in the previous century, the 19th century, the 18th century, etc. Your royalty would raise an army. They would go off. They would fight a war. They would leave, by and large, whichever country they were fighting the war in, they would leave the civilian populace largely alone. Certainly, some people would get their, small villages and homesteads raided and razed, but it was usually highly frowned upon. The moment we get into democratized wars, we end up with countries being versus countries. We end up with total war. We end up with bombers flying over, dropping bombs, literally just annihilating cities. Instead of wars where armies fought armies, it becomes country versus country, and it's a very nasty turn for the last 100 years. It really is. And those wars are, I'm really jumping ahead, but the way we get out of the Great Depression is a war. The way we get out of almost every single time we have had a crash of the stock market is we have an international emergency of some sort, like a war, or as we've recently had, a pandemic or whatever, there is something that requires huge amounts of blood to be spilt. Blood is turned into money via gunpowder. Almost
Yes.
invariably. And it ain't the rich and powerful's blood that's being turned into money. It's the general populace. It's the little guy wandering, just keeping his shop and selling cabbages to his local community. It's their sons, it's their daughters that are being annihilated by this. It's a very, very nasty turn of events. This whole thing. So I'm.
It is, yes, it is. I was going to go through another Mises link here, but it actually fits better with the Calvin Coolidge and laissez-faire stuff. Sorry, I'm moving our sources around a bit here. So
okay,
I think we've really hammered the point home here. So I think we need to move on because again, there's a lot to cover here because there is a big section of it's 3 or 4 pages, but it's still big. There's a section of Rothbard's Great Depression that I think really brings home both the disastrous situation in the British Isles and the disastrous situation to try and remedy it, which was what Rothbard describes as welding all the reserve banks together: the Bank of England, the Bank of France, and the Federal Reserve, and the German Deutsche, I can't remember what it's called, the German Central Bank. End up all kind of stuck together in this essentially what feels like a suicide pact of inflationary policy, because what we have here is not just America doing this; it turns into a worldwide phenomenon. But we have to understand the situation in Britain at this time. I'm sure you're aware of how, I guess, shit the 20s were for Britain, despite its public image.
Oh, I know. I was talking to a friend the other day. In fact, I mentioned it. They were going, "Oh, you're getting into this period. That's the height of the British Empire." And I was like, "I hate to break it to you, mate. It really wasn't. It was the death."
Oh yeah,
we'll
talk about that in the next slide, really, because we do have kind of the post-war decline, which is what we'll get into here. But Britain financially is just on life support at this point.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Which is odd because we hadn't taken a huge amount of direct damage from the First World War. There had been planes flying over, dropping bombs on cities. There'd even been Zeppelins on occasion, although by and large we hadn't seen sort of what we were going to see in the Second World War. That hadn't happened. So most of our industry was intact. You would think a country with a gigantic economy and a gigantic empire would have weathered this all very well, but no. We'd been sold the debt as well, and as we had been turned as, what was the turn of phrase you used, the detonation, which every time I think of it, I just think of an explosion, which is kind of what they'd done to us. England had just bought more and more debt through the war. And yeah, England's economy was crippled in the process.
What we've seen really is the fact that the World War I was a disaster and ruined basically everyone involved. And to keep the exercise going, there had to be international kind of almost fixing of economies and planning of economies to stop the whole thing from falling out from under itself. Yeah, like you said, Britain's a detonation. It's the fact that they have in 1927 they try and return to the gold standard, but they have a problem because they can't. Because what's happened is that I think that the pound is about 14% more devalued than it is supposed to be as compared to where the gold standard is. They are essentially fiddling the books. They want to go back to the gold standard, but they've inflated too much of the value of the pound away. So the pound wouldn't buy the amount of gold it's supposed to. And what they really have to do is they have to, it culminates with a meeting of central bankers, which we'll talk about in a sec. But this really is Britain admitting behind closed doors that it is just fucking done economically. And it's a return to the gold standard, but it's an illusionary return to the gold standard. And a lot of economists and a lot of historical texts will talk about by 1927, a lot of countries had quote unquote return to the gold standard, and that was part of the problem that didn't allow them to increase the money supply when the Great Depression happened. Because as Keynesianism will tell you, just keep printing fucking money. Basically, just keep shoveling it in there, and the gold standard is vilified via this fact. But what really happened is that Britain, through the demand really of people and through people who wanted to be able to functionally exchange their money for gold, they had to reconcile the fact that they had debased their currency to a degree that they did not want to admit. And that is a great through line here, that nobody throughout the 20s wants to admit how bad things are. And it's just everybody lying and printing money.
Well, yeah, we'd also got the issue with England had basically decided that we were going to do socialism by stealth and bring in the dole, so unemployment benefit, the insurance for the average working man who suddenly finds himself unemployed. He can turn around to the state and go, help, I need some money. And I've paid all my taxes all this time. Could you please give me some of that back so that I can feed my family? Sounds reasonable enough. Sounds lovely, in fact.
Again,
but sorry.
Maniacal Foreigner in the comments, says, in the chat says, they done over fiddled the knob and there ain't no unfiddling it. That's funny, but it's also true.
Yeah. They
go on, Trig, you were ranting there. I cut you off mid-rant.
They'd pushed it up to 11. No, we had created the dole. We had created unemployment benefits, which is now job seekers allowance, but essentially it's been the same for the last 100 years, which is it's very comfy. It's a very nice idea that anyone in England that doesn't have a job will be able to, pay his rent, support himself and his family, without having to go to work because big mummy government is there with her teats for them to suckle off. It is a dribble only, but it is just enough. But at the same time, this is a colossal amount of money that the government has to raise.
And I don't have a source on screen because a lot of what I could find was either academic sources behind paywalls or just like stub articles, like the Wikipedia article. But yeah, historian Charles Locke Moat does literally just call this socialism by the back door. He does that in Britain Between the Wars, 1918 to 1940, on page 43 to 45. But I couldn't find a copy of that we could display on stream.
A lot of socialists do like it via the back door.
They do, yes. They do like it by the back door. But unfortunately, this period in British history is criminally underanalyzed, especially from like an Austrian point of view. We don't have like a Rothbard book on British economy. It touches on it, and it touches on it through the lens of the acts of the Federal Reserve and central banking, but there's no real kind of examination, at least not that I've read. If anyone wants to tell me about it, there's maybe some Hitchens out there. And, both Peter and what's the other Christopher and Peter Hitchens maybe would touch on this, but really we don't have a lot of criticism of things like the Unemployment Insurance Act, because when it was passed in 1920, unemployment was actually very low.
Yes.
And surprise, it immediately almost by 1922 had like doubled, if not tripled. The amount of unemployment went up massively in a short period of time, and as is always found in these countries, the welfare bill outstrips anything they could ever have imagined it would be. It is kind of crazy.
Who would have thought? The moment you give people money for nothing, an awful lot of people find a reason to just
and you
not be on the
free. Yes.
Yeah. Well, who would? If someone was going, here, I'm going to give you all the money you need to live for free, why would someone go and start sweeping the streets?
Well, it's a further kind of incremental move towards the welfare state. Nobody really voted, for socialism in the UK. Nobody really voted for the welfare state as a concept at this stage. In fact, I think a lot of the populace would have seen that as disastrous and selfish. But what you see is that the populace, once you get mass democracy, will incrementally vote to enrich themselves. That's what it means. It means that they will incrementally vote to enrich themselves. And fundamentally, most people do not understand economics. And they don't have control over what the elites actually do. What the elites do behind the scenes is mass debasement of the money supply, mass debasement of currency. But what all that they are shown on the surface is, well, we can give you unemployment insurance.
Yeah. And they sell it in a very, very nice way, and it's all spun out to the populace as oh, isn't that's nice, isn't it? Oh, it is awkward when you lose your job and you're left looking for rent because you'll be out on your ear if you're not careful. It's lovely that government will help you out there. Why have my taxes gone up 5%?
Well, it's not just that. It is handing over a private function to an inefficient, centrally governed body. And what happens is the unemployment insurance, it doesn't go to unemployment insurance. The taxes to justify it end up going to further servicing the war debt and further trying to correct all the mistakes that they made with their previous monetary policy. It's always niceties. It's always, we will look after the poor, we will look after the sick, we will look after the jobless. We will be compassionate to our fellow men. But the end result is they empower themselves. That's always what it is. It's always the fact that they will use that to empower themselves. That is the end result. That's how you go from safety net to £1 million drone strikes. It's how you get £100,000 bombs dropped on children. It's how you get a massively overinflated budget used to create human misery and horror. It's always predicated on helping your fellow man. It's always predicated on altruism, and it's always predicated on niceties. And it's always sold to you in a utopian, almost childish way. But if you create a situation where the government is responsible for you if you can't work, then the government essentially becomes a paternal figure. Its power increases almost exponentially because it becomes, the father of the nation. It becomes the guarantor of your safety. You essentially become in that situation a ward of the state. You become public property. It's the implications of it, if you think them through to their logical conclusion, are horrifying. But all people see is, well, if I'm out of work, I'll get some money.
Yeah. It's because the average general bloke out there, bloke or lass, they're not economists. They're not deep. They're not even deep thinkers, to be perfectly honest. Bear in mind that bell curve.
Well, they don't need to be. They're not supposed to be. They don't have time to be. No. That's the thing. What the idea of technocrats in the modern sense is so tempting because people know that inherently themselves. It's this weird exchange of elites empowering other elites, but in the name of your vote. You end up with this weird paradox where the public opinion is absolute and sacred, but the public is also stupid and feckless and so inept that they have to be ruled by technocrats. It's this weird conflagration of both of them. And like I said, though, all they do is they listen to public opinion when it lines up with what they want to do. Public opinion is a myth. There's actually a good video on Academic Agent's channel, just literally called, Public Opinion Doesn't Matter. And when the public will runs counter to the interests of the elites, they will implement what is in their interest and not quote-unquote public will.
No, and then they'll propagandize the public will, so the public will changes to match what they've done or what they're about to do.
And then the aspects of policy the public do want on a popular level that align with their interests, they will implement and they will demand you congratulate them for it. That is how this works. that is how the illusionary process works. Again, we'll talk about the theory of that more when we get to the kind of myth of totalitarianism, really, because essentially everyone, once you get to the 1930s, is totalitarian to some degree. You have total societies, and you can't have total war without them. But anyway, we're getting a little bit off track here. There's a great section of Rothbard's Great Depression here, which starts on. Sorry, I think it's, where is it here? It's page 155. in the book itself, and if you're reading along at home and reading the notes, it's page 198 if you want to do a page number in the PDF itself. But Rothbard here is talking about Benjamin Strong. You'll remember him way back from episode 1.
Yes, one of those guys at a certain island in Georgia. What was it?
Yes. Jackal Island, yes.
Not Hyde Island, but yes, yeah.
No, it is Jackal Island.
Yes. Or
he's also the man who was named as part of the board of the Federal Reserve by Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. He's one of the men who funneled money into Europe during the Great War. He's one of the men who must have at least known about some of the plans to empower the Bolsheviks. Strong, we're in the 20s here. Benjamin Strong has been essentially partially controlling the money supply and economics of the US outside of an elected position for 17 years, but by the time I get to 1927. He's a constant presence. And he was involved in a process that was despised in the popular imagination, which was the creation of the Federal Reserve. They didn't want the banks to be cartelized. But here we are in the 20s, still dealing with Benjamin Strong. And Benjamin Strong, in reaction to Britain's massive, massive problem with trying to return to the gold standard, and its need to basically fiddle the books globally, what he did was he decided to, again, page 155, he remained to weld their inflationary pact. Norman and Strong agreed to embark on a mighty inflationary push in the United States, lowering interest rates and expanding credit. An agreement which Rist maintains are concluded before the Four Powers Conference had even begun. Again, there's a secret meeting of central banks in 1927. And it kind of goes before a political meeting. Again, this was not done in the open. This was done secretly, as we'll come to later. Strong agreed to buy $60 million more of sterling from the Bank of England. The British press was delighted with the fruit of the fast Norman Strong friendship, and flattered Strong fumiously. I quite like that word. Fulmously. I can't fucking read. As early as mid-1926, the influential London journal The Banker said of Strong, no better friend of England existed, and praised the energy and skillfulness that he had given to the service of England, and had exulted that his name should be associated with that of Mr. Walter Hines, page as a friend of England in her greatest need. Paul, there's a footnote here which is really quite interesting that says that Paul Warburg, that Warburg, yes, the Warburg from the Soviet encounter, well, his brother at least, his tribute to Strong was even more lavish. Warburg held his Strong as the pathfinder and pioneer, thank you, in welding the central banks together into an intimate group. He concluded that the members of the American Acceptance Council would cherish his memory. It's amazing how much these people aggrandize themselves. But there he is. He says that he was the pathfinder and pioneer in welding the central banks together into an intimate group. This is the event that makes the Great Depression on a global scale possible. Without the, essentially forced conglomeration of the central banks of the great powers, none of this could have happened. There would have been a degree of resilience. There may have been a reset to reality in certain places, but on a global scale, this could not have happened. Sorry, to move on to page 157, to abridge this quote a little bit, it goes into the fact that interest rates were lowered, there was a large amount of false economics that went on. Reserve banks were told by Strong that the new burst of cheap money was designed to help the farmers in English land. Basically, the money printer go burr.
I love that term. I love / hate that term of cheap money. That's that is madness right there. The fact that no one just went, what are you talking about? There is no such thing as cheap money. A dollar is worth a dollar, or if a dollar is cheap compared to the other dollar over there, there's some shenanigans going off. It's not real money. And how on earth people didn't line up with rope and lynch this lot, I don't know. But
the big thing is something we'll cover a little bit later. Is the dynamic here is that Calvin Coolidge is somebody who he's small government based. He does want to minimize the size of the state. He's not very successful at it.
No.
Like I said, knob fiddling. But he's actually quite in bed with the inflation. He's actually quite happy with it. He doesn't mind the inflation, which is weird. Whereas Herbert Hoover is actually quite interventionist, but he's a bit more wary of the inflation. He seems to know what's going on here. But you end up with Strong basically getting the backing of the American government to do this. He goes round them, but he gets away with it. And he gets away with it because they are, again, just addicted to the quote-unquote cheap money. And to go back to quoting Rothbard here, sorry, the reason for Strong's devious and secret methods, again, this was done in secret, as well as the motives for his inflationary policies, have been no better described than in a private memorandum by one of Strong's staff. In the spring of 1928, Strong firmly rejected the idea of an open, formal conference of world central banks. In the words of his assistant, he, Strong, was obligated to consider the viewpoint of the American public, which had decided to keep the country out of the League of Nations to avoid further interference by other nations in its domestic affairs, and which would be just as opposed to having its heads of its central banking system attend some conference or organization of the world banks of issue. To illustrate how dangerous the position might become in the future as a result of the decisions reached at the present time, and how inflamed public or political opinion might easily become when the results of past decisions become evident. Governor Strong cited the outcry against the speculative excesses now being indulged in the New York market. He said that very few people indeed realized that they were now playing with the penalty for the decision which was reached as early in 1924 to help the rest of the world to a sound financial and monetary basis. Basically, America bailed out the rest of the world and realized they couldn't pay their bills.
This is 1928, so the Great Depression is lurking at this point, waiting to pounce.
Well, he's speaking almost in doomed terms, though. He said that they had to do all this in secret because the public would lynch them. They'd lynch them for interfering when they said they wouldn't interfere in world affairs and let world affairs interfere with domestic policy. But he's also hinting at they're going to lynch them because the fucking depression's about to happen. Like, this guy knows.
Yep.
He's hinting at it. But this is my favorite part because this really links in with our theme here. Rothbard says, in short, in our supposed democracy, if the people were allowed to know what had been transacted in their name, and what penalties they were subsequently being forced to pay, they would rise up in wrath. Better to keep the people in ignorance. This, of course, is the familiar attitude of the bureaucrat in power, but what of the fundamental question it raises of democracy itself? How can the people decide upon issues or judge their presumed representative if the latter insist on keeping vital information from them? There we go. Mm-hmm. That is really the crux of what we're talking about here. Sorry, I've been talking about ages. Trig, please elucidate.
Well, this is why there's a phenomenon that we've all had the chance to see it in our lifetimes at least once, where a newly elected official has just got the power and everything, that he's now prime minister or president, and he's been full of bravado, and he goes in and he seems to go into a back room, have a conversation with some people, and come out looking pale.
Yes.
And this is what they suddenly get hit with. The fact that everything that they just ran on, all the things that they've just been talking about, no, they're now in charge, so they've been let into the big secret, and that is that if they say anything and don't carry on doing exactly what was done before, they're probably going to get lynched, they're probably going to die. Horrifying things are going to happen to them, and everything that they thought was real isn't, because it's all been a lie.
Well, again, it's what Strong did. He did to alleviate the previous crisis. That is what we always see here. The crisis gets bigger because they kick the can down the road to alleviate the previous crisis.
But it's a crisis of his making. Yeah. It's his crisis. It's the crisis he's made, and he's kicking the can down the road because he doesn't want to pay the piper his due, which he's created, and he's insisting on making millions and millions of people pay for one man's mistake or a handful of men's mistakes. And frankly, the Great Depression, people died in droves. People starved, people committed suicide. Huge amounts of people suffered horribly at the hands of a few very, very wealthy people who saw it coming and did nothing but make a bigger problem later, over and over again.
There's also
the
admission here that this is an affectation of state intervention.
Yes.
And internationalist intervention at this stage.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I was about to say this is where people go, oh well, this is because capitalism fails. This is where I'm going to start using Hopper's terms. This clean democracy. Clean democracy's never been tried. Clean democracy versus state-meddled, Keynesian capitalism is a mess. Clean capitalism, rather, very rarely barely had a chance to exist. It was annihilated by democracy, by democratic and bureaucratic meddling, and by people wanting to centralize power where power should be as decentralized as possible, especially with regards currency. And don't get me started on crypto, because no, that's not what I'm talking about. But centralized control of economy is not capitalism, and that is what the last 100 years have been all about, is about centralizing control of the economics.
And yeah, there's a little sting in the tail here from Rothbard. He says, again, Strong himself did not realize how heavy a penalty the American public would be forced to pay.
Bollocks.
He died before the crisis came.
Well,
he does this and promptly fucking drops dead.
Well, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad he died. It's almost a shame he didn't get to see it, because maybe he might have, had some remorse. But he died thinking he was doing the best thing. But yeah, no, good. Glad he died.
Well, yeah. I said, if the public had at last been let in on the truth of Strong's actions and their consequences, perhaps during the Depression, they may have become more, in quotes, inflamed against inflammatory government intervention rather than against the capitalist system. Mm-hmm. It's true. They were telling the lie in real time. They were telling the lie to the people as it was happening. They were saying that this, they did this, and they obviously don't want to admit they did it. They don't want to admit that they meddled and they got it wrong. And not only did they get it wrong, they got the fact that they should meddle in the first place wrong. It's amazing that the lies of central bankers have been codified in world history. That, again, the meeting on Jekyll Island back in 1910 was done in secret for this very purpose. The meeting of the central banks in 1927 was done in secret. The policy was enacted in secret. The banks were welded together in secret. America massively inflated its money supply and then lent a lot of it back to the Allies and bought a lot more debt off them, partially in secret. None of this was done with the proper controls in place that are supposed to be inherent to a democracy. What happened is, like I said, all they did was take the money and power that was given to them by the populace, and they ran with it.
You want democracy? Get yourself a toga, get yourself a knife. That's how democracy needs to be done.
That's how democracy works.
Yeah.
This is how democracy works, yes.
Go back to Rome, go back to Athens. That's you can't have a democracy running properly without it being, a couple of thousand people at most. This is not democracy, what we've seen in the last 100 years. This certainly is not democracy. This is centralization of power and smoke and mirrors. Democracy, the phrasing, the terminology, the giving the people the power and the vote. This is all smoke and mirrors, so you don't feel the handcuffs being stuck around your wrists.
It is that's what this period shows, and it's perfectly elucidated there that the voters will never have enough information to be able to reach the decisions that they are supposed to make. Never mind the system and its failings. Never mind the very lie that mass modern democracy is predicated on. If your country has state secrets, then democracy can't exist because you fundamentally don't have the information that the elites do. It falls down on its face just by that fact, just by the power and information gap. Never mind the dilution of mass democracy, like Harper talked about. Never mind that you're one of 70 million voices, and functionally what you say does not matter. And your power is reduced the more people can vote, just by the very fact that you simply just do not have the information. And you cannot have the information because it's being hidden from you. And it's being hidden from you as a function of the state and the elites and the very people that are supposed to be our representatives. And there is no way to fix that because these people will always move in their own self-interest. But anyway, good lord, we need to get on to other stuff because we've still got quite a lot to cover here.
Yes, you are absolutely right. Where are we now? Oh yes.
Post-war decline. Yes.
Post-war decline, and little bit of military action to start talking about as well, which is
a little bit,
fun.
Yes. I think first what we should do is just briefly talk about the political situation in the UK at this time. I've got the sources a bit backwards there. We need to look at who was in office and, not really who was in power, because no one was really in power during this period. It's kind of weird in that we have this period of political chaos and stagnation. The predictable result of mass democratization was
by that, you mean the predictable result of the coupon election?
Yes.
The very, very predictable result of that. Yes. Where are we? Let me find it. Here we go. Oh yeah, that's right. Lloyd George should probably because he's losing it at the rapidly at the roundabout throughout this period.
Here we go. He was in office until 1922, but really he was only in office until 1920. The Conservatives under Bonar Law decided that basically he would be prime minister as a figurehead until 1922, in which his star had fallen so far that Bonar Law took office. But what you get during between 1922 and 1924 is a series of governments that last less than a year. You have Andrew Bonar Law in office, you have Stanley Baldwin in office, then you have Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, in office. But these people are only in office for, 210 days, 246 days, 288 days. And eventually it settles on Stanley Baldwin. But Stanley Baldwin really is almost like a caretaker. In fact, again, he takes us through to 1929, but he doesn't really do any reversal of policy. And it's a picture we will see time and time again with both the Republicans and the British Conservative Party, in that all they do really is a bit of a holding pattern. He took office after the crisis we'll be talking about, but there is just stagnation and chaos politically in Britain during this period.
Yeah.
It's hard to get a grasp on because nothing fucking happens, really.
210 days. Yeah. 210 days, 246 days. This is less than a year for these two. I mean, it was quite interesting because the way that Lloyd George got ousted was the coupon election. And essentially he was up to, I can't remember exactly the details of it, I'll have a look in a minute, but he was basically pissing off the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party...
It's 2 years afterwards.
Yeah.
The coupon election was 1920, and 2 years afterwards they go, we can rule without you.
Yeah.
Because he was, like I said, he was the Liberal head of a Conservative coalition. It was a very weird situation.
Yes, but they didn't need the Liberals in it. And so they ousted him, and then proceeded to cock up 2 years in a row, essentially. Useless.
Well, also, what you see here as well in the guise of Ramsay MacDonald is the British Labour Party going from a faux radical movement into being folded into the British establishment and becoming part of the cycle of elites. Again, to skip a bit ahead, once you get to the Great Depression, Ramsay MacDonald actually thinks that Keynesianism is too extreme. We'll talk about it in full then, but it's kind of amazing how different the Labour Party is from its more Marxist roots. They are fully integrated at this stage with the British establishment. And none of these people, despite these short-lived governments, despite any of the crises they went through, really manages to affect any change. Like I said, this is a period of stagnation and decline, both domestically and internationally, as we'll now look at. But I just wanted to make sure you understand the kind of the political chaos in this period in the UK,
Yes.
And the instability in the British Isles itself. But yeah,
This is
do you want to talk about the Channel crisis?
Yes, because this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Is my friend went, oh, this is the greatest period of the strongest period of the empire. It's like, no, it wasn't. We were in our death throes. We might have had a lot of land holdings during that period of time under the empire, and big armies, but those armies were costing us fortunes. And suddenly, this particular event took place, which is the Channel crisis, which was,
Yes.
by and large, essentially Turkey, the UK, and Greece kind of coming to blows over this little area here of near Istanbul and the Dardanelles, which we covered before. With the Dardanelles was oh god. Which one was it? Oh god, I've forgotten the name of the damn beach landing and so on, where the Anzacs died. Churchill's mess. But anyway, the Dardanelles.
Oh, you mean Gallipoli?
Gallipoli. Thank you. Yeah, same sort of area, same sort of people we were fighting, and England essentially was coming to blows with Turkey being a little bit aggressive and trying to seize some land and saying, we're going to have this land, we're going to have Istanbul, and England saying, no, we're not. We're going to issue an ultimatum and demand that Canada and various other people, as part of our glorious empire, come to war with us and kick Turkey's ass. And Canada went, no, get fucked. We agree that we are related under the crown, but you, British government, do not get to tell us when we send our lads abroad to die for you. No.
Yeah.
We're going to discuss it in Parliament, but we're not just going to jump when you say jump. And this is a massive blow for the British Empire as such, because at this point it's not an empire anymore. If Britain is an empire, it has control of its subordinate countries, and Canada has just gone, no, we are not under your control, we are not under your rule. And fortunately, the British commander in this situation didn't actually issue the ultimatum to the Turks, which would have probably kicked them off and started a war. As he was wise and didn't issue that and thought, you know what, I'm going to hang out for a few days and see if we can't sort this out diplomatically. Wise, probably saved an awful lot of lives. In the process, Turkey seized a whole bunch of land. Greece had to give up a bunch of land, and this kind of sets the stage for other Turkish aggression against Greece in the future. But by and large, the big take-home thing here is that, oh, that's right, this is what kicks off the Carlton Club meeting. So, yes, that gets rid of Lloyd George, is that the empire is collapsing. The countries like Canada are just going, no.
This is the event that causes the instability I talked about earlier. This is what gets rid of Lord George. This is what makes the Conservatives go, we can rule on our own. Spoiler alert, they can't. And this is really what shakes the confidence of the British people and really just functionally ends the British Empire, I would say. I would say the British Empire ended the moment the British Expeditionary Force got slaughtered in 1914, and Britain went from being an illusionary superpower to being essentially the sick man of Europe.
Yeah.
But here really is where we lose control of Canada, we lose control of New Zealand, we lose control of Australia in terms of foreign policy. It leads to I think it's the Treaty of Westminster.
India would have probably jumped at the same time, but even then, India was getting shaky. It is interesting that the Conservatives didn't want to go to war here.
Statute of Westminster, sorry.
They didn't, but it was the Liberals. The Liberals did.
Well,
the Liberals under Lloyd George and this man who I used to I used to idolize Winston Churchill. I've loved a lot of his speeches. I've listened to a lot of his speeches throughout the last God knows how many years, and he was a good speaker, and he was very, very witty, and this and that and the other. And oh my God, when you actually look into the things he was up to and doing during this period,
it's all PR. It's all lies.
Yeah, he was a bit of a shit.
He's like FDR. It's not quite as bad as FDR, but he is lionized because he has to be.
Yeah.
Because if what was actually done was revealed to people, they would have not accepted it. He is part of the myth of history. But yes, Winston Churchill and Lloyd George are the two people who rashly decide that Britain is. They complain during this. Actually, there's a great quote that Britain and France are complaining to the League of Nations and to America that they can't be the world police, which is hilarious considering America after 1950.
Yes.
It's so ironic what happens here. But this really is functionally what creates a situation where Britain is no longer an empire. It can no longer depend on its territories, on its dependencies for support. Mm-hmm. They can just say no. Once you get into the 30s, Canada and Australia and New Zealand can just tell Britain to go fuck itself. If they really want to. They have now wrestled control of foreign policy domestically. And like I said, Britain was a paper tiger before World War One. It was a shredded paper tiger after World War One, and now it's just done as an imperial power.
As I say here, Britain has become Britain and the Dominions as an autonomous community within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate to one another in any aspect of the domestic or internal affairs, though united by a common allegiance to the crown. Essentially, Canada was saying, yeah, you're England, but you know we're Canada and we're equal to you. We have the same crown. That's it.
Yeah, that's
Screw
it.
you.
Well, again, it's adherence to the crown. It's old allegiances, not new allegiances. And what happens here is that you could make an argument that democracy, really, and the weakening of the crown and the weakening of the old power structures is what caused. It's what caused World War One. It's then what caused this to end as well.
It also suggests that if it was the crown saying we're going to war, they might have done, but because Parliament had said it, they went no, get fucked. Which kind of bless them on that front, to be honest.
We're going to talk about this a lot more at a later date because we have a lot more to say about the old power structures. Don't worry, we are going to settle this. But the king has a different authority than an elected official.
Yes,
he draws on different aspects of the human spirit, and he draws on something that isn't even, I would consider, nationalism, because they don't subsume themselves to the state. They are a higher power, and ultimately they are backed by God, which is again a whole other topic we'll have to get into. But really, this is the fruit of that. And again, we're kind of hinting at a bigger truth here. But we really have to move on, I'm afraid.
You don't want to jump into owner versus caretaker then? Okay.
No. It's a bigger subject, and like I said, there is so much stuff we're leaving out, but don't worry, the series will touch on them. We just have to do all the history for now to talk you through what's been happening here. Now we get on to Weimar Germany. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, hold on a second. Oops. Sorry. There we are. Let's just this image. Where you found this image from, I don't know, but it's great. It's great. Look at that. Look at those. That's a lot of paper. That is. That's a whole stack of paper right there.
Again, this is going to be probably more abridged than a lot of you guys were hoping for, but we will be covering a lot more of Weimar Germany in not the stream next week, but the week after, when we talk about the kind of rejection of quote-unquote liberal democracy and the kind of what became known as the totalitarian systems later. But it's important we talk about Weimar Germany specifically through the lens of American credit, because Weimar Germany is an invention of American credit. That's what it exists on. That's what it subsists on. It is a fictitious nation and a fictitious economic situation based on the unreality of credit expansion, as we talked about later. We are everything you are taught about Weimar Germany, about the post-war booms, about the Roaring Twenties, is fake. And it's not fake because it didn't happen. It's fake because it was just based on printed money. And Weimar Germany is one of the only places that's allowed to be told, at least semi-honestly, because the indulgence in inflation-based policy and monetary economics that caused the immediate post-war crisis, i.e., what Germany was doing during World War One, is exactly what they kept doing. They had to keep the lie going. And the only way they could think of doing that was to push massive amounts of printed American money into the Weimar Germany economy. That is what all of these plans were.
It was, and it was the Young plan and the Dawes plan, if I remember rightly, fellas. Just
yes, we have a mainstream history source on this, is this is from history.state.gov.
Well, that's about as normie as you're gonna get, I'm afraid. This is not going to be many base takes in here.
No, but you can read around a lot of it, because in their view of history, there's almost hat tips there. It's quite, and they do elucidate to the fact of what is actually going on. I don't know. Do you want to read? We already know about the U.S. loans to allied powers. We already know about the fact that they borrowed massive amounts from the U.S. Do you just want to read what the Dawes plan and the Young plan were there?
Okay, let's go for this. Right, the Dawes plan in late 1923, with the European powers stalemated over German reparations. The Reparation Commission formed a committee to review the situation. God, I hate that.
Yeah.
Committees to review the headed by Charles G. Dawes, Chicago banker and former director of the Bureau of the Budget and future vice president. The committee presented its proposal in April 1924 under the Dawes plan. Germany's annual reparation payments would be reduced, increasing over time as its economy improved. The full amount to be paid, however, was left undetermined. So it's an open-ended debt.
It's a blank check.
It's a blank check. You Germany will keep on paying us until we say you've paid enough. Economic policy making in Berlin would be reorganized under foreign supervision, and a new currency, the Reichsmark.
Reichsmark.
Yeah. So Germany is not being given any autonomy here at all. France and Belgium.
Well,
Sorry, go on.
Kind of. It's America pretending to be kind, but sorry, keep reading.
Yes. They're hand-holding them through it. France and Belgium would evacuate the Ruhr, and foreign banks would loan the German government 200 million to help encourage economic stabilization. U.S. financier Jean-Pierre J.P. Morgan. Jean-Pierre... Actually, is this Jean-Pierre Morgan, or is this his son now? Because this might be his son.
It might be Junior, yes.
Because I think Jean-Pierre Morgan has died at this point. Lol.
Yeah.
Get dead. Floated the loan on the US market. God, I hate that man so much. Which was quickly oversubscribed. Over the next 4 years, the US banks continued to lend Germany enough money to enable it to meet its reparation payments to countries such as France and the United Kingdom. So essentially, America is going, here you go, have some money, and then Germany's going, oh, good, here you go, England, here you go, France, have some money back, and England is then going, oh, great, thank you, I owe you some money, America, and paying that back. So a big circular, circle jerk going off at this point.
Yeah.
These countries in turn use their reparation payments from Germany to service their war debts to the United States. In 1925, Dawes was the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition for this plan's massive circle jerk and the resolution of the crisis over reparations.
Well,
this is such fucking nonsense. It's untrue.
You have to see this in the context of what Rothbard was talking about when he talks about the welding together of the central banks. Because all of this is being done with interest. America is on paper making money from this.
Yes.
But what's really happening is it's a giant Ponzi scheme. It's a giant Ponzi scheme in which the US prints money, fictitious money, that goes into Germany, inflates the German economy, which then goes on to Britain and France, who then use it to pay America, which goes on to pay Germany. And nothing actually really gets resolved or done. It is a stopgap, it is an emergency measure, and it is a massive, irresponsible, again, credit expansion to keep the show going, because if Germany defaults on its debts, France and Britain can't pay America, and the music stops.
And the moment the music stops, people go, hey, let's have a look at these bank notes and let's audit the Fed. By the way, audit the Fed. Damn, that came out quite... yeah, I mean that. Really, really with all my heart. The moment people stop being able to pay, the moment everyone realises the debt is nonsense anyway. And yes, this is just further and further into debt. You're printing money, you're devaluating the currency, you're paying it over to you're giving it to these people, lending them with interest, and everyone's just getting further into debt in the process with the money that they don't even have. It's all fake. It's nonsense. This is a shell game.
Well, the reparations and the disgrace of the reparations is played a lot in history as a through line of Germany from like 1918 into the 1930s and 40s. But it's not particularly accurate the way that's framed. It's not really a disgrace that's being imposed on Germany by the Allied powers. It is in many aspects, but what's functionally going on economically outside of the rhetoric is that America is using Germany as a money funnel and a credit funnel to keep, like I said, the entire situation going. The reparations, yes, they are unfair, and yes, they do create a burden on Germany, but they can't just simply get rid of them, because then, like I said, Britain and France fall down. So America goes through this whole show of the Dawes Plan and then the Young Plan, which is basically, the Young Plan is the admittance that the Dawes Plan failed.
Let's read the Young Plan, because in the autumn of 28, another committee of
we'll just read that first paragraph there because it goes a bit out of period, but
was formed. And this one was to devise a final payment, German
final
reparation.
Solution, as it were.
Yes. The committee, under the chairman of Owen D. Young, the head of General Electric and a member of the Dawes Committee.
That will come into play later. General Electric, eh? What are they doing?
GE. GE is such a fucking big company these days. Good God.
We'll talk about this. Comes into the rise of the Nazis later on, but yes, go on.
It does. A plan that reduced the total amount of reparations demanded of Germany to 121 billion gold marks. That's almost $29 billion, payable over 58 years in small monthly payments. Another loan would be floated in foreign markets, this one totaling $300 million. Foreign supervision.
Yeah.
A foreign supervision of German finances would cease, allowing Germany to actually sort out their own finances, which would take the reins off for actually a rather startling German recovery in the 30s. And the last of the occupying troops would leave German soil, again allowing Germany to recover quite well in the 30s. The Young Plan also called for an establishment of a Bank of International Settlements.
Yes, to facilitate the payment of the reparations. So what happens is, essentially, I think they kind of know the music's stopping in 28, because they start to pull back a little bit. But during the period here, up until 1928, Germany's a vassal credit funnel state.
Yes.
that's all it is. And again, if we quickly, I think there's a little bit in Rothbard here. Oh, where is it? I won't go through it exactly, but what they talk about foreign acceptances, and they talk about the mass finance expansion into Germany itself, and the Federal Reserve has the power to repurchase a lot of these foreign debt agreements. So they basically just keep buying them back. It's really fucking weird. They'll sell them and repurchase them and try and increase their value. It's fucking crazy.
It's so freaking iffy. The shit that was being pulled back then. I am amazed they got away with this. I really am. Part of me is kind of hats off. This is wow. How did you manage to do that? But at the same time, good God, what a bunch of scumbags.
Yeah. The German bonds didn't rebuild German capital because it's just old debt. They started lending to local state governments and not to private businesses. The loans actually made capital scarcer in Germany. And basically what happened is the Germans realized this. The Germans wanted to be more responsible, but the American banks sent out hundreds of agents into Germany to try and basically persuade all these people to accept this debt. It's really crazy what happens. Again, I would encourage you to read it. I encourage you to read Rothbard's Great Depression.
There's a reason there was trouble in the streets in this era. What America, what this loan lending, what these reparations were doing. There's the very good reason why the general people, the youth, the people in general, the people that might go to beer halls were getting very, very, very upset about the general state of what was going off in Germany.
The thing is, what was happening in Germany, apart from the reparation situation, is exactly what was happening in Britain and France and America. They were having to inflate away a bunch of bad credit. And they were putting out bad credit to solve bad credit. It was fundamentally the same situation. But it's just the fact that, things went pop harder in Germany because it was more damaged. It's fundamentally the same policy. The disastrous hyperinflation policies that people talk about with the Germans and the money printing is exactly the same thing that America is doing, just at a slightly slower pace. It's incredible that people can hold those two ideas in their head and not realize that it's horseshit. Because America's printing money to enrich itself, and Germany's printing money to enrich itself. But one of them is historically seen as a disastrous misstep, and the other is seen as what was needed to be done more in order to recover from the Great Depression. It's this weird cognitive dissonance in which American money prints are good, German money prints are bad.
Well, yes, absolutely, and then suddenly, for no reason whatsoever, they elected it. The thing is, this is all a case of history being written by the winners. If things had changed, if things had gone differently, this may have been, the massive inflation, hyperinflation that happened. It wasn't as bad as what's happening in. In fact, was it as bad? It was probably not far off as bad as what's been going off in. Oh God, what's the freaking country in South America that's just shot out of my head?
Not Argentina.
Not
sorry.
Argentina.
Venezuela.
Venezuela. Thank you. God, my brain sometimes. Yeah, Venezuela. It was Venezuelan tier inflation. If not, I think in Venezuela it was actually worse at the present moment. It's quite
like I said,
insane,
once the crisis happened, they couldn't hide reality anymore.
Yeah.
But none of it was ever real, and it was the same in the UK. It was the same in the US. It was the same in all the other countries that run into problems because of World War I and the credit expansion and inflation that facilitated the total war spending of that. They are still trying to essentially solve the crises going back to 1900. Mm-hmm. They're trying to solve the problem they created with central banking. And what's happened is in the time period we've covered is 1900 1914, we've seen central banking come in and the expansion of the interventionist state in Britain, and that has culminated in World War I. And World War I has been a disaster for everyone involved, despite America thinking it could enrich itself via it. And to fix that, they've done the even bigger credit expansion via the Federal Reserve and private debt expansion, and they've turned that on the people. They put the people in debt as well as the countries in debt. But what they're trying to do is fundamentally fight a reality that they've been fighting for the past 20 years. 20 years plus at this point, in that them interfering in the economy has only made things worse, and it's like a sunk cost fallacy. They just, or like a Chinese finger trap. They just keep getting their hand further stuck without realizing that that's all they're doing. They are making a bigger problem down the road to fix a previous problem, and every time they try and fix it, it gets worse. We'll get into a lot more of the economic theory stuff next time about Austrian economics versus Chicago School economics versus Keynesianism and the horseshit of that. But what we can see functionally happening is that every intervention they do to fix the last crisis makes the next crisis bigger.
Yes.
And the policies, like I said, the policies that cause that and the policies that are derided in Germany are the same as the policies in the US and the UK. It's just that there's this magical glossing over of, well, they did too much, or well, they did it badly. There is no actual theory there as to why one would work and why one wouldn't work. Apart from the fact that we can keep the lie going by being a bit more subtle, is the most cynical way of looking at it.
Yeah. By and large, that about wraps that up. It is. It's you tell a lie, and as long as you keep on telling it and make sure it's an absolute whopper. The moment you get called out on it, just change it slightly and say it again. And they buy it. They buy it over and over again because there's, when you're printing the money, you can make sure that you have all of the propagandists / journalists saying the same thing. And as long as everyone's saying the same thing, the little guy on the street doesn't get anything other than that noise.
This is what happens when you abdicate, your responsibility for your own economics.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, this is what happens when you give a government complete control over the money supply. This is the 20s are the end result of that. And the end result of the 20s is the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash. One leads to the other, one feeds into the other. And, you can ask, well, what does, the minutiae of monetary kind of theory have to do with democracy? Well, everything. Because what you end up doing through mass democracy is you end up creating the unreality that leads here. One is a factor of the other, and one is linked to the other. And they are both aspects, in my mind, of fighting reality. But again, we'll get into more of the theory stuff a bit later. This is more about kind of just hammering the myths of the Great Depression, really. Which, again, we come on to next, which is I think the most pervasive myth, which is the myth of laissez-faire.
Ah, yes. It's a shame it didn't actually happen, because, a laissez-faire economy, an actual one, might have weathered the depression. We probably wouldn't have had the boom and bust we've had for the last 100 years over and over again, because a completely free economy without governmental meddling tends to work a lot better, in my particular opinion, and I know I'm not alone there. Yeah, here we go. So we've got Hoover and Coolidge.
Yeah, we have Hoover and Coolidge. We talked about Warren Harding, who was president from 21 to 23, the lying, corrupt bastard. We have Calvin Coolidge, who is president from 23 to 25. He's president from God damn it, brain.
23 to 29.
Yes.
30th president of the United States, and I've got to say, he dressed well. I've got time for the way he wears he cuts a nice suit and tie.
He's right there throughout most of this period. This is Coolidge's decade, really.
Yeah.
And his kind of I think it was the equivalent of finance minister is Hoover. He's right there. They're right there making policy together, really.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with this, and the reason we skim over the politics here and the politicians, is that a lot of the time they don't actually matter. Unless you get someone like a Woodrow Wilson who just bends the shape of reality into his will and just smashes the Republic into pieces. Yeah, Calvin Coolidge is, I guess, what you would describe as a minarchist. He's someone who believes in small government, but he never gets there.
He's
like in the
He's your guy that he got into power and then was taken into the back room and told that no, he couldn't do any of the things he wanted to, and then just sort of stood there in front of the public and said small government, lower taxes. This is what I'm promising you, and then gave him a little bit of it. I kind of feel sorry for him on some levels.
I kind of do, but he is a perfect example of the uselessness of the conservative movement in the 20th century, in that what he does is he slightly cuts taxes away from a total war situation, and he calls it good. And he completely takes his eye off the ball, and even endorses a lot of the credit expansion of the Federal Reserve, which in of itself is interventionism. I don't know how anyone can say when there is mass kind of increase of the money supply that isn't government economic intervention, because it is. These are members of the Federal Reserve, which is a codified government body, the president, appoints the heads of the Federal Reserve Commission. They essentially set policy. Just because he's abdicated a lot of that to an external body, like we'll see a lot of that, just because he's essentially given it to technocrats, doesn't mean that this isn't economic interventionism. This is not laissez-faire. How anyone could describe this as a laissez-faire, pure capitalist economy and then call the failure of the market a capitalist failing is insane. It's not. I think we've gone through and conclusively proven it's not. The body of what we've talked about so far shows so much interventionism to the point of it has to be done in secret. There's so much of it, and it's so bad, and it would be so unpopular. Yet the myth of history is that this was a laissez-faire period because Calvin Coolidge wasn't a fucking communist.
Yeah. Yeah, he's almost a patsy that's been set up. He's been brought in there. He is not quite a libertarian, but as you say, he's a small government conservative, as they say here. But he's not running a laissez-faire economy. He's tried to. Or at least he's certainly said it in public, and he's tried to be he's tried to get America out of international politics. He's not joined or stayed out of the League of Nations. But by and large, whilst that's going on, the bankers, the international financiers, and so on, in the back rooms have been doing an awful lot to do the opposite, and they have been. Controlling.
Hoover during this period was Secretary of Commerce. He was Secretary of Commerce from 21 to 28, actually. And again, the idea of Herbert Hoover as the do-nothing president, they talk about. They talk about that he wasn't an interventionist and that he was a laissez-faire capitalist, and that's why it all failed. Herbert Hoover sat there, as Minister of Commerce. Yes, he's urging against some of the worst excesses of credit expansion, but he also wants a bigger government hand in the economy itself and in policy itself. Between them, Hoover and Coolidge, between Coolidge's acceptance of credit expansion and Hoover's kind of advocating for intervention, they create, almost like the perfect storm of, leftist policy in a way. They are Republicans who are allowing, the roughshod of state capitalism, China style. Yeah. It's corporate socialism in many ways. What they're doing is, in abdicating their responsibility and allowing the Fed to be as powerful as it is, they are still intervening in the economy, whether they acknowledge it or not, and whether history acknowledges that or not. I don't understand how anyone could view these facts and still believe these myths. It is so apparent to me. It is so apparent on just the basis of history as it happened that's the case. It's amazing how the Great Depression and the causes of it are taught to people. Again, once you get here, the myth of history becomes enraging to me almost. I don't understand how anyone can believe any of this. It baffles me.
The thing is, it's actors on the stage. We, as the audience, the general public, get to see the actors on the stage. We don't see the directors. We don't see the guys doing the lights and the smoke machines and the fans and doing the makeup and all we are seeing is the actors that dance around on the stage. And it really doesn't matter who's up there. You can put, as long as they've got the right lines and have been dressed up in the right suit, it doesn't really matter who goes up there. It's the director, it's the people that, putting the show together for us that actually make a difference. And Herbert Hoover, Coolidge, they are, once again, just actors on the stage. Woodrow Wilson was actually a main player, but so many politicians, they just go up there and they do what they are told, or they are advised, shall we say, strongly by experts, and they do what those advisors tell them to. They do actually have the power. It is within that actor's power to turn around and go, no, sod this, I'm not gonna carry on with this script. But by and large, when they do that, they soon get removed from the play.
They do, yes.
Sadly, as Kennedy found out, actually. But shall we show them what the see?
This is what people. Yeah, this is what BBC Bite Size shows as the causes of the Great Depression.
See, I cringe about this because the moment I think you're going to stick anything with BBC on it, there's the oh my god, they're going to annihilate us for nicking their products and so on, because the BBC are really bad for it. But
Really?
they cover this whole Roaring Twenties period so very quickly. Overproduction, underconsumption, agriculture, overproduction and underconsumption in consumer industries, decline of traditional industries, government policy of laissez-faire led to insufficient regulation of the stock markets and banks. The government needs to regulate these things because politicians, they know how to deal with this far better than these bankers, because politicians are elected and they used to be car salesmen and sheep farmers, and they know far better than...
Well, that's the implicitness, the implicit view of history here. But keep going.
Yes, the government policy of protectionism, which reduced America's trade with other countries, increased debt, partially due to new methods of borrowing at low interest rates.
You see, they kind of gloss over it there. It's like that's basically the only cause.
Yeah.
In fact, it causes all of this. It causes the overproduction, and it causes them to produce more than demand. Why would you produce more than market demand if you weren't acting on credit? You can't do it without the credit there. You can't overproduce beyond demand without easy credit. It doesn't work. That's how you overcook an economy.
A laissez-faire free market corrects for overproduction or underproduction really freaking quickly. The stock market corrects to that really quickly if it's not meddled with.
Again, we will talk about this in greater detail, but economic policy in this period went from measuring interaction to coercing it. And that is fundamentally when you get into the realms of unreality. In fact, you could argue that from 1905, 1906 onwards, the economy just isn't in line with reality at all, because they are not measuring economics anymore. They're creating policy. In terms of like economics as free interactions between people, the idea of having interventionist economic policy is like having physics policy to change the way physics equations work. It's just, once you look at how the actual interactions work, it becomes nonsensical. But again, people might see that as a sweeping statement, but I think we'll be able to prove that during next week's stream.
We've got government literally dictating to scientists at the moment what they can and can't say. So we are getting to that point. We're literally getting to regulation telling, biologists and geneticists what they can and can't say as to whether or not something's politically correct. So, this is the start of it. 100 years ago, we are now in total freaking clown world, as you well know. But they are actually trying to do that. Just government overreach is wild at this point in time, and as it was back then. Where is it? Massive speculation on land and stock market prices leading to inflated share prices. There was massively inflated share prices. There were trading companies that had very sort of £6 million worth of holdings in companies that were suddenly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sorry, I've got to switch from pounds to dollars mid sentence there, but same diff essentially. $6 million, I think it was a car company, was held by a trading company, and that trading company's shares totaled something like $600,000. And that was over speculation on the stock market, but that could only have happened through the lending of money and the wild drive that the Fed and everybody else had created within the stock market. And it would have corrected. Those companies would have gone bust, been wiped out, and it carried on. But anyway, do you want to go on to that Mises piece?
There's a quick part here in the Mises article. Right, it's actually quite near the end here.
It's the Mises
because we've covered most of this already. Yeah.
Right. Okay. There we go.
This is a writer for the Mises Institute called Paul Johnson. He's actually commenting on America's Great Depression by Rothbard. He's basically kind of not giving it a review, but commenting on it here. But he makes a good point here, talking about Coolidge and Hoover quite near the bottom. It's where it says.
I'm actually.
Yeah,
this is where I've been quoting these areas down here that I'm just highlighting here. Yes, were the overinflation. But where are I? You know what?
It says where Hoover's was the only department. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's the bit it's been quoting. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, this is quite useful. It will be linked in the references again. But again, this
Mises.org, great site.
Yeah, this quite well elucidates what was happening here. Hoover's was the only department of the U.S. federal government which had expanded steadily in numbers and power during the 20s. He had constantly urged President Hardings and Coolidge to take a more active role in managing the economy. Coolidge, a genuine minimalist in government, had complained, "For 6 years that man has given me unsolicited advice, all of it bad." When Hoover finally took over the White House, he followed his own advice and made it an engine of interference. First, pumping more credit into an already overheated economy, something he'd actually previously warned against. When the bubble burst, doing everything in his power to organize government rescue operations. Now we see, thanks to Rothbard's insight, that the Hoover-Roosevelt period was really a continuum. So again, we're not going to get too far out of the period here, but Hoover was not an anti-interventionalist, as is said in the history books. And again, we'll elucidate that a bit further during the next part of the series, and as we go over some of the more details of the economics next time. But Hoover is not somebody who is laissez-faire. It's the myth of laissez-faire. I don't think you can even make an argument for it. It's just, again, it just baffles me. But there's one couple of aspects we need to get on before we get into the final judgment here. But I might kind of gloss over them a little bit. I'm sorry, we are kind of like short on time here. I want to try and keep this under 3 hours. But yeah, that's, again, I hope most people can understand that, like, laissez-faire bullshit, pure bullshit. We are. Yeah.
So
I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. Again, we don't have a source on screen for this because I just want to talk about it as a subject area in general, but we have to talk about a little bit of Prohibition in this era. Because it's important, but it's important for how it interacts with democracy and the expansion of states. Because I think we covered it quite well last time when we talked about its origins as kind of the meddling of special interest groups, and specifically kind of like the temperance movement being interlinked with the suffrage movement. But what you end up with really is that the FBI and the Bureau of Prohibition fill the role of kind of the watchman of public vice very enthusiastically. And you begin really in this period to see the rise of the security state in the US, specifically the federal security state in the US. I know you have a lot to say about this, Trey.
Yeah. Well, this is it. You've got. I mean, I rambled on this. In creating the Prohibition era and banning alcohol, you created the gangsters. You created the mobsters, which created the need for the FBI and what then becomes later the ATF.
Well, a quick side point. Sorry, we talked about it last time, but the communists were used in a similar way as an excuse for the Firearms Act of 1920 in the UK.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes. And you basically got this sort of, again, it's a circle jerk, but it's a circle jerk at the cost of the general public, of creating a problem and then letting that problem run wildfire, then creating an absolutely monstrous institution to deal with that problem. And here you go. This is what I'm talking about. Is that, as we all know, we now have in America the ATF, who they just love your puppy.
Yeah, they do. They are dog lovers there, but not in the way, not even in like the white girl's way. They're
no, and you end up with these organizations, the ATF, the FBI, being immensely powerful, being funded so incredibly heavily that, as you can see there, actually in the main picture, I'm going to take this nice image of a puppy dog away.
Oh no!
What you've got there is is that Hoover in the background with his Tommy gun there?
Yeah, that's Hoovy with the Tommy gun there. That is Hoover with the Tommy gun.
That Tommy gun there. Now, a Tommy gun back in those days, I think it was retailing at around about, it was a couple of $250 or something. It's about
$300 actually. It was very expensive.
Yeah, it's about the equivalent of about £6,000 or £7,000 worth of gun, or dollars worth of gun in modern day terms. So not far off what you'd actually cost to register an actual machine gun, under the present day. But back in those days, it was a monstrously expensive gun. The only people that could afford a gun like that were, well, Al Capone and his gang.
Yeah, I'm gonna say they were either gangsters or government,
Gangsters
and they got into
or
a bit of an arms race. But
and, yeah.
that would come to fruition during the 1930s. But really, prohibition during this period is it's the state's role in policing vice. It is the personification of the state's role in policing vice, and in filling that role, they once again empower themselves. They get more funding, they get more power, and they get more control. And you will see this mirrored with the war on drugs. Prohibition is really the prototype, or it's what's drawn on for the war on drugs. It's a very similar situation in that agencies like the FBI and the ATF are predicated on the idea that you go out and you fuck up your fellow man because of what he enjoys.
Yeah, no, and it really is at no point in history up until this point has the government or the state been the arbiter of your moral guidance.
Well,
before
it
then,
has.
it was the church prior to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, it had, but it had under the auspices of religion. This is really the first. It's not even secular, but it is secular. It's using religious fervor. It's almost like the Hegelianism stuff. It's using religious principles for secular control. And it is subsuming, it is the state subsuming the role of a church and a religion in policing people's vice.
Yeah. And you'll see sort of warrantless wiretapping. Literally the idea of where the church is there going, and God hears all and sees all. The government at this point is listening in on your phone, and now listening in on your phone probably as I'm speaking, because your phone's a mobile phone, it's got a microphone, etc. But even back then, they were wiretapping whoever they wanted to. They were listening in and wanting to, basically police what you were up to in your own home, and God help you if you liked a little spot of whiskey, and
Well, we see during this period, 1924, we first see J. Edgar Hoover become the head of the FBI. And 1924 onwards is really when you see the warrantless wiretapping. J. Edgar Hoover was in office until 1972. That the man was the head of the FBI for nearly over 40 years. Yeah, it's kind of crazy, his influence. And J. Edgar Hoover, he was the thug. He didn't recognize famously didn't recognize the existence of the mafia, which is kind of funny. He was an extremely corrupt individual, and the FBI under his auspices essentially became a state mafia. Yeah. Like I said, they indulged during the 20s in warrantless wiretapping. And it really is the first auspices of the security state, but it is done under the guise of fighting for prohibition. It's something that people wouldn't recognize today because it's not part of their moral pantheon. But they would recognize it. It really is just the 20s version of the war on drugs. And you begin to see how the 1-2 punch happens here of you have expanding society for welfare needs and expanding society for democratic needs. But also, with the other hand, they expand the state and lock down society to keep, so you can use your vote as a cudgel against your neighbor. And all of this ends up with a bigger state. And it ends up with the people in charge of the state being more powerful because they have, more power to wield. That is what the end result of all of these democratic processes are. Man votes to enrich himself, man votes to punish his neighbor, man votes to punish foreign enemy, government gets more powerful and never gets less powerful. That's all we ever see, and it's just another arm of that.
Yep. Yeah, and you know what? He really is though, because without, I mean, I'm going to stray a little, because the moment they, even after the prohibition of alcohol was dropped, they very rapidly went and got in bed with paper manufacturers and went, this hemp stuff is an interesting one. We could actually, if we made this illegal, that would, because the paper manufacturers were invested in pine, they saw hemp as a massive worry for taking over the paper industry. And all these hippies and or beatniks, as they called them, and the black community in America needed keeping under control, and the FBI and the feds needed a reason to keep them under control and under observation. And they ended up, after the alcohol it went straight over to the criminalization of marijuana. And boy, did that go wild, actually. That was some really, really ugly plays by the American government during that time, because they made it illegal worldwide and basically told any country that didn't play that they wouldn't give them medical supplies and any of their new, antibiotics and painkillers and so on. And a lot of people died in very, very unpleasant ways in hospitals because of American foreign policy and brutality on that front. Because up until, when was it, in the mid 1930s, marijuana was legal. People were smoking rope, as they used to call it back in those days, because hemp rope was everywhere, and they're just
smoking rope.
Smoking the rope was very, very popular, and it wasn't until they abolished alcohol that they got into that. And again, it was a method of control and a reason to grow the state armory to further subjugate the general public.
Yeah, it is the subsuming of the role of the church. It is the policing of vice.
Yes.
And again, all it is self-empowerment.
Yeah, but you don't get to go into the DVLA and beg for forgiveness and say the the Pledge of Allegiance 15 times and get us absolved of your sins. No, you go to jail and you make number plates. Slave labor again.
Well, there's one kind of, again, it's not out of place, but it is very important to the period. It's something we are unfortunately having to gloss over, but it is there, it is going on, and it is still an example of how democracy empowers the state. The other myth I really want to knock out before we finish and get into before we get to the final discussion, really, because there's a little bit of discussion to have with the benefit analysis here, is there is a couple myths that are interlinked here. And you've managed to get the archive up here that I haven't managed to get up, so I'll be relying on you here.
We have the archive, yes.
The two intermingled myths that I think can be busted here is the inevitability of the Great Depression and the fact that it was a quote-unquote failure of capitalism. And the only people really who predicted the Great Depression in any great detail were Austrian economists. People like Ludwig von Mises. There's actually a Wall Street Journal article here about how Mises predicted the Great Depression.
Yes.
And was one of the only people to fully explain why it would happen before it happened. There's a couple of other people. Sorry, go on.
As I was going to say, yes, there were, but he really called this out. He warned of a crisis in the early 20s. In fact, he spelled it out in 1912. The cycles of all of these things, but he wrote a gigantic tome, The Theory of Money and Credit, and he wrote it in German, and nobody translated it. So nobody read it in America or England because whatever, but he called this all out way beforehand. Yeah. And to jump ahead, essentially, he was offered a banking job. Where was it? Way back into the late 1920s, that he turned down. A very, very well-paid job. I'm trying to find where it is. And his wife was very, very unhappy about it.
His wife was pissed off, yeah.
Well, pissed off, and he went, no, I am not going to have my name be in any way, shape, or form attached to what is about to happen. Here we go, yeah. Poor Ludwig was very nearly alone in warning of the collapse to come from his credit expansion. In mid-1929, he stubbornly turned down a lucrative job offer from the Viennese bank Creditstalt, much to the annoyance of his fiancée, proclaiming, "A great crash is coming, and I don't want my name in any way connected to it." And he called it. He knew it was going to happen, and everyone thought he was a madman.
Well, not really. I don't think they thought it was a madman. I just think they were all drunk on their own credit. And again, not to get too much into the discussion we're going to have in a bit, but I think a lot of people knew this was coming. Certainly, the secretary to one of the heads of the Federal Reserve, Benjamin Strong's secretary, seemed to know what was about to happen. I think they all knew what was happening, but they knew that they'd fucked up so much previously that they had to continue down this path because they didn't want to get hung. Like I said, Strong got to die before he ever saw the results of his work. It really is just a case of paper mashing over the cracks until you are no longer seen as responsible for the mess. And that really is another damning thing about democracy, which we talked about before, is the cycling of the elites. Again, we'll cover Burnham in detail at some point. But, it's the fact that by the time someone, is going to be held responsible for their actions, they've already left office. And it might be a decade down the road before you see the fruit of what someone has done in office. And that really is the great trick of putting new frontmen up every so often. There isn't, like I said, there isn't a king there to hold responsible. There isn't a continuation. You have a president for a maximum, eventually a maximum of 8 years. You don't get term limits properly until after FDR. But really, you have, in the UK, some of people there for less than a year. And they can do great damage in that time. And the damage itself will be hidden by the elites around them. And they will be long gone by the time people realize what's going on. And then they'll just move on to the next crisis. That's the real failure there. But,
yes.
Yeah, sorry, go on. Mises... what was I going to say?
Do you want to read from this a little? Because there's some good bits in here.
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
So, taking his cue from David Hume and David Ricardo, Mises explained how the banking system was endowed with a singular ability to expand credit and with the monetary supply, and how this was magnified by government intervention. Left alone, interest rates would adjust such that only the amount of credit would be used as is voluntarily supplied and demanded. This is very, very simple. This is how a market works. Yeah, you demand stuff, it is supplied to you. But when the credit is force-fed beyond that, we call it a credit givage, or gavage, grotesque things start to happen, which is what is happening. What we've just spent the last 2.5 hours describing is these grotesque things that happen. He called all of this. Government-imposed expansion of bank credit distorts our time preferences, our desire for savings versus consumption. Government-imposed interest rates artificially below rates demanded by savers leads to increased borrowing and capital investment beyond what savers will provide. This causes temporary higher employment, wages, and consumptions, but it is only temporary. Ordinary random spikes in credit would quickly be absorbed by the system, the pricing errors corrected, the half-baked investments liquidated, and the supple tree yielding to the wind and then returning, like the supple tree yielding to the wind and then returning. But when the government holds rates artificially low in order to feed even higher capital investment in otherwise unsound, unsustainable businesses, it creates the conditions for a crash. Everyone looks smart for a while. But eventually the whole monstrosity collapses under its own weight through credit contraction or worse, a banking collapse, which is what we have seen so many fucking times in the last 100 years. And the only way out of it is a war, incidentally.
It seems to be, yes. But what he's describing here, again, we'll talk about time preference in detail next time. We have to get into the Austrian stuff. To juxtapose it with the Keynesian stuff, because time preference sounds complicated. It's really quite simple. In that it's, do you want stuff now or do you want stuff later? It really is that. It's to do with, again, people's preference for immediate consumption or saving. And that, people with a high time preference are savers, people with a low time preference are spenders. And once you understand that, you can really understand how interest rates work and how interest rates reflect people's time preferences. And then how artificially low interest rates are disastrous. They are just, again, unreality. And that's what he's describing here. They're describing the process of unreality.
Incidentally, the picture I've just stuck up on there is someone with a projector The other day. This is the Bank of England's main building.
Well, they have the Bitcoin thing on there, which is kind of cringe.
Which is cringe, yes. But the print Mises not money is kind of a little bit based.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah. There's someone running around London. Well, the Bitcoin thing is a bit cringe because there's a lot of people who don't understand.
Crypto will not set you free, guys. Do not believe them.
Crypto might make you some money, yeah, but do not think crypto is an unregulated monetary system that is untraceable, etc., etc. It's the most traceable system ever. It is by
design. By design, yes.
Yeah, by design.
But yeah.
This is not the crypto stream.
What this Wall Street Journal article is describing is the process of unreality. You kind of leave the moorings of honest, interpersonal or interbusiness economic interaction and start getting into a fictitious economy, which is what the 20s is a prime example of. But no one seems to be willing to admit that apart from the Austrians. So we kind of bring ourselves onto the the power axiomatics of this. It's the calculations here. It's what are we actually seeing functionally? Where are the exchanges of power? Because I think this is a bit of an interesting one. Because it's not as obvious as it is in some of the previous periods. Because yes, there is policy passed in the UK, like the socialism by the back door of welfare and employment insurance. But in the US, it's a bit more on the surface level, a bit more difficult. But when you get down to it, really, and once you see this as the consequence of mass democracy, it becomes a lot more understandable. Like I said, I think the best thing about doing this and the best thing about this view of history and kind of combining Austrian economics with a much more skeptical view of democracy and really, really understanding how power dynamics works is that history actually makes sense. This is, I think, one of the first times that all these events have really made sense to me, honestly. In researching this series, it's been revelatory as I've been creating this, because I've had a grasp of some of this before over time and have bits and pieces of it, but bring it all into one place, really just go, wow, okay, this just hangs together, this just works. You can just prove this.
Yeah. I mean, I've spent a long time going government bad, government overpowerful, and look at all the shit that they're covering up, guys. Don't believe the lies that they tell you to your face. But you're right, actually. In researching this, there has been some really, really eye-opening bits, especially the whole Wall Street bankrolling the Bolsheviks bit. Really, really blew my mind. Really did. It was unbelievable how.
And the same people who did that are the same people who were doing this, who did the credit expansion.
Yeah. We always knew socialism was creeping in, rapidly over 100 years in England. But the bankrolling of it was just. Ugh. And the crap that's going off in the background, the fact that these socialists are in bed with each other and sometimes literally, and certainly dodgy dealings behind the scenes with arms dealers and so on with Lloyd George, and there's been a huge shift in wealth and power from anyone that owns anything to those that would have the general populace vote them power, or vote them the ability to give themselves as much power as they want.
Despite at the end of the period eventually faltering, again, what we see really here is the amassing of power once more by the international financiers and the central banks. But these are people who are working under the auspices of government. These are not rogue capitalists. This is not independent power. This is not just money that is doing this. This is central banking that is doing this. And with the hidden welding together of the central banks and international finance, as overseen by political entities and government agencies, that is the real mechanism that drives global events. It doesn't matter essentially what policy is. if the central banks are acting in this manner. You can set whatever economic policy you like. Economic reality is governed by the policy of the central banks because they control the money. They control the money supply, and that is the most powerful thing in a democracy like this. In a monetized democracy, in a democracy where people use, notes as provided by the state, the person who controls those notes basically has absolute power because he controls all resources in a overarching state that has a monopoly on violence and the monopoly now on what is economic reality, or at least as far as it can try to hide it. And through the process of central banking and through the pressure to intervene, not just from the banks but also from now the populace, who has begun through like this Bolsonianism to believe that the government is the only way to get out of this crisis, it becomes ever expanding. You get the banks that propagandize the population. That gets the government to enrich them, and they don't enrich the populace. They enrich the banks and they enrich themselves. But that's the lie that's told them. They're told that through government intervention they can enrich themselves, and it never ends up happening. The elites get more powerful. The banks get bigger. The financiers get more control. But no one ever really increases the economic standing of those who are the lowest down. And that's the excuse for it. The excuse is we're going to make the poor less poor, and we're going to do it by soaking the rich.
Yeah.
And it becomes, like I said, it just becomes self-sustaining. The path that Woodrow Wilson set essentially is like rails at this point. The unreality of the position isn't revealed until much after the events have already happened. In effect, the interventionist economy is self-sustaining and ever expanding, and in doing so, it expands the idea in people's mind of the fact that government intervention is the only way to settle these crises. It really, I think, that is the worst aspect of all of this, in that what happens is by quote unquote solving this during the 1930s, by solving the Depression with more state intervention and more credit expansion, what they're doing is ingraining in people's minds, ingraining in voters' minds, and ingraining within the fabric of democracy that democracy means that you vote for the government to do more for the economy. It inspires the belief in monetary policy in the populace, whereas monetary policy really has nothing to say about the economy because the economy is not something you can actually control. Again, we're going to get back into that when we essentially debunk Keynesianism, but it becomes almost like part of the mind virus. You believe through democracy that you're a powerful person who affects the state. And now you believe through democracy you're a powerful person who affects the state and can govern economic reality by saying what it should be rather than just dealing with what it is. And really, like to finish my little rant here, and you can sum up yourself because we've got a little bit of time here, but what I've put down in my notes is when the demand for reality outstrips the supply of unreality, then you end up with the depression or the war because they can no longer maintain the lie. And that's all they do. The prosperity, the 20s, the roaring 20s, everything that comes before and after this, under the auspices of interventionist economic policy, is just unreality. It is just a lie. And all the elites do is they trick you into empowering them to continue the lie. That is what happens. They are the arbiters of the lie, and they make you believe through many of these processes that you need the lie to survive. And I think that is the ultimate evil here of the 1920s. They caused this process. They are the villains, and they have managed to write themselves in history as the heroes. It is very twisted.
Here's my rant on this, because it's occurred to me, well, I've known this for a while, but it's becoming more and more solidified that this is the new religion of the atheist world. Yeah, the fiction, if you will, of an all-powerful God, etc., looking over you and so on. Now, I've quoted the lines from Deus Ex and so on before. But the fact that this is a fiction, that as long as you believe in it, it has power, and as long as you believe in it, it gives power to those cardinals of that particular church. They get more and more powerful. But if everyone just turns around and goes, "No, I'm not buying into your shit," yeah, it starts to crumble. The moment people go, "You know what? Let's actually have a look through your books. Let's see how much of this is real. Let's audit the Fed." The moment you actually start to look into the reality of it, their illusion crumbles. It falls to pieces, and which is what the Great Depression. Hilariously, it affects all the cities. It affects a lot of the other states, but Texas and several states didn't even touch them. Why? Because they weren't buying into the bullshit that Wall Street and the coastal cities were selling them. Yeah, if you don't buy into it, if you don't buy into this fictional debt, if you actually look at what they're selling you and go, "No, thank you, Mr. International Financier, I will struggle through. I don't need to borrow money from you. We'll work it out. We'll find a way." Yeah, they will come for you with guns so freaking quickly because they cannot afford for you to show everybody else that they are lying scumbags, and they are trying to imprison you and enslave you with their lies. If you deny them and you have the guns to back it up, they are done. Every single time.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that this credit is quite literally forced on people.
Oh yeah.
It's quite funny that once you get to the way Germany is, that Germany is essentially given no choice in accepting this.
Yeah.
And
they
like I said, their role here is a conduit.
Yeah, and those loans to Germany, it was here you'll have someone here to guide you through it. They didn't get the choice. The money came into it, didn't give anything to Germany because that money went back to France, back to England, who then had to pay America their debts. That money just went around in a gigantic circle jerk. And one guy there was sat there with a very big grinning face because he's the one getting jerked off. He's enjoying himself. The rest of them are just sitting there jerking away. It's a horrendous. The cardinals of this church disgust me more than... I mean, I have a problem with a lot of religions and their excesses and their problems. This is the worst of them.
Well, the problem is once you get beyond 1924 for a lot of people, and especially once you get beyond 1927, I think no one's enjoying themselves because they start to realize what they've done. You know, the people who have instigated this start to see the fact that this is just going to fall down because it's not real.
Yeah,
that's the point. None of the growth was real. The Wall Street crash wasn't a crash; it was a correction. It was a fall back down to reality. And the fact that is recorded in history as a bad thing, and yes, it did have terrible consequences, but it had terrible consequences because people had been undertaking economic activity under the auspices of lies for the best part of a decade.
Mm-hmm.
This is what happens when you lie to people. Really,
yeah.
You can't fight reality, and all economics, in my mind, apart from a decent subset of Austrian economics, really is just that. It is justifications for fighting reality.
Yes.
And especially Keynesianism. I mean, people make arguments for the Chicago School and, I guess a laissez-faire Keynesianism almost, and monetary policy and government intervention in a limited sense. But all this really shows is that what they did, to try and paper the cracks over World War I is what caused the Great Depression. It's really simple once you say it that way, and I'll repeat myself. All they did was print money and create imaginary growth. And that is why it all tumbled down in 1929. It doesn't have anything to do with laissez-faire capitalism. It doesn't have anything to do with agribusiness. It doesn't have anything really to do with overproduction, because the overproduction is a symptom of the credit expansion. Credit expansion and printing money will always cause a crash. And if it doesn't, all you do is go further into the auspices of unreality, and you end up with a situation that we actually find ourselves in now, where we are so many layers deep into the lie that when things finally do correct themselves, the collapse is going to be immeasurably worse because we have delayed it for so long, and we've made things so much worse by distorting people's economic preferences and making people act within a system that does not reflect the reality of how humans interact. And that's what we're going to talk about in great detail on the next episode on our Keynesianism special, because once you realize the evils of that and the evils inherent in that, you really start to be able to kind of kick against the system. But I don't think you can really understand democracy without understanding economics. The two have become so interlinked and became so interlinked during this period that you have to understand the monetary tricks and lies that allowed them to get away with what they were doing to the populace, and then feed that back into them by making the populace believe that they were the ones who were making this decision. It's so insidious once you see it. It becomes a feedback loop, and you have to just keep lying to people. That's all it is. It's just you have to just keep telling bigger and bigger lies and coming up with more contrived theories and more terrible ideas, really, to keep the lie going. And there's a very big lack of honesty here. There's a very big lack of, people wanting to engage with reality because they can't face the consequences of what they have already done.
Yeah. Yeah, and so they make it worse every single time. I mean, the Great Depression, how long did the Great Depression go on for? To the 30s, mid-30s, late 30s? We didn't really recover from it until the 50s and 60s, essentially. The Second World War and the ramping up for war actually got us out of the worst of it. It's the time and time again. It is always they get themselves into a gigantic mess. You need to basically burn the money. Almost because of the massive amounts of inflation, and the only way to burn that money seems to be throwing farm boys into a meat grinder.
It's
blowing the crap out of them. Yeah, and it's horrendous.
Once you understand that, though, and once you understand that a lot of government, waste is essentially burning of inflation, it starts to make sense, and it starts to you start to be able to see a lot more clearly what's happening. A lot of people get very confused by the political environment. And again, we're going to be ending in a second because this is, again, it's been quite a productive stream, but I think we're just getting over 3 hours now, which yes. I do try and avoid generally. Right. But again,
I've just got a good anger on, dude.
Yeah, no, it's true. But what we are dealing with here is the fact that we haven't yet dealt with the actual economic consequence of World War I today.
No.
All we have done is paste layers of unreality over it. And that is really, again, what the process of democratization has done. It has allowed people to vote to stay in a dream world. And it has sold people a convenient lie that through their collective action, they can defy reality. And again, it's something that Soul talks about very, very well in the constrained and unconstrained vision, which we will, I keep mentioning it, and if you know about it, that's great, but we'll cover that in detail when we get to the 30s, because that's the time period it fits in best. But what you will see here is the magical thinking of democracy is what leads to the magical thinking of, further interventionist economics, and it becomes a feedback loop of magical thinking. That fundamentally, if you try hard enough, you imagine hard enough, and you are utopian enough, that you can change reality to your will. And again, it's Hegelianism. It's like Hegelian Superman, that through the power of society and through the power of the state, that anything is possible, no matter the confines of physical reality. And you will move ever upwards towards utopia if you just believe hard enough and you just fight reality hard enough. That is the process we started describing, a few weeks ago in part 1. That is the process we'll keep describing, because that is what's happening. But it is, as Hopper describes, it's the great fiction. That's what that's talking about. It is the great fiction. History itself is a great fiction, and the idea that humanity, through its will, through some sort of Faustian nonsense, can transcend itself and become a superhuman version of itself through just the power of the human mind. A lot of people believe that. And a lot of people will get angry at me for saying that that's new, but it's not true. You have to live in reality. And the 20s was a sustained period of unreality. If you take away nothing else from this stream, take that away. The 1920s only makes sense when you see it as a dream world.
Yes. Oh.
Sorry,
no, I've had to. I'm having to take deep breaths and calm myself. I was on a. Whoa.
It's fine. Like I said, we need to round it out now. But thank you guys for bearing with us through this. Like I said, we're trying to segment them down a bit. This was a bit less truncated. This was a bit less rushed. I think we've got the pace of this and the number of topics right now. Yes, these are going to keep being about 3 hours, but I think that was a good discussion, especially a good final discussion there. I don't think we have any more donations, but we got a big spurge of them at the beginning. Again, thank you guys for subscribing. Thank you guys for joining, and thank you guys for the donations. You've been very generous again this stream.
I mean, what's it?
Normal
Skull
shilling
gave us 50. Yes. Was it $50? That's
thank you, Skull. Yes.
Wow. I mean, thank you very much, dude. That's I think our biggest donation to date.
But yeah, we're like I said, I think we'll probably get quite a few views on the VOD. We usually do with this. You guys have been very hungry for knowledge. We will be back next week at the normal time. I'm actually hoping at some point between now and then to do a bit of an update video on this series and give people a bit of a roadmap, because I know it's been kind of meted out in kind of piecemeal sections. I want to give people a better idea of where we've been, where we're going, and the ideas, and maybe some further reading. Because a lot of people, again, the response has been extremely overwhelming. Normal boilerplate stuff, you can follow us on minds.com. Both me and Trig use Minds. It's all linked down below. Please join my Discord. Again, link to that down below. A few of you have joined already. I still do seal of approval with Rose of Dawn. I was ill last week. She was ill this week. That's why it didn't happen. It's just, illness, basically, and people being busy. There's nothing really going on there. Don't worry. As you may have heard, Dump with Scrump is no longer happening, but that's really been the case since November. I know I said it wasn't the case. I was being very hopeful there, but really there hasn't been anything recorded meaningfully since November 2020. So that should tell you all you need to know about that, really. Like I said, reality asserts itself eventually. And that's all I'm going to say on the matter on air, because I think it's not a productive subject area.
Well said. Yes.
Is there anything you need to shill before we go, Trig?
Not well. We were supposed to be doing some more D&D last week. I don't think that happened because Uzlu was ill. But eventually, this D&D stream that I'm supposed to be doing might happen. I think we're at about 8 weeks of trying, and we've had 2 episodes. But that might happen. That might even go up on the internet at some point in the near future. But if not, we'll be doing that in Cabal's D&D room. But do join Cabal's Uzlu's Cabal Discord server. It is more autistic than most. Yeah, no, at the present moment, that is all I am shilling. I have actually been asked to do a Deus Ex playthrough, and I was considering whether to do that on this channel or actually to stream that on my actual. I've got 2 YouTube channels, that neither of which I ever use to put anything up. But I might actually start having a playthrough of Deus Ex as a stream, just to chill out every now and then. But not immediately, because I've got too much reading to do. I have no time to play games at the moment. I'm not allowed. Sad face.
No, apparently, yeah, we've chained up Trig and he has to keep reading. No, I already hate the state. No, you'll keep reading, Trig. No.
Just yes. Yeah, no, I will do that soon though. Because Deus Ex, if no one's ever played it before, it's me playing that with my commentary alongside could be fun. I don't know. Plus I know that game like the back of my hand. But no, other than that, I think it's been this has been a good stream. I've enjoyed that. I got a good rant on there. I like having a nice rant every now and then. It gets the blood pumping.
It does.
Yes.
Oh man.
I hope other people have enjoyed it. We've got plenty of people watching. Smash that like button, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring the bell. Kill me,
so
kill me,
cringe.
kill me!
So
I said it.
cringe.
I actually said it. I knew it.
Yeah. But yes, like I said, I'm glad we've been able to do this quite consistently, and we are in this for long haul, guys. So thank you for bearing with us. This is going to be quite a long series of streams. We might take a break in between to do some more, hopefully more evergreen stuff. I'm really been turning away from doing more current event stuff. But again, I will probably elucidate you guys on more of a channel update. So for now, I will say goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Anyway, I'm going to turn the stream off.